Section 1. On the 26th of July, in the year of our Lord 1540, the Protestant town of Einbeck in Lower Saxony woke to a morning so hot that the cobblestones burned through the soles of leather shoes. By noon, a fire broke out near the marketplace. Within hours, the entire town was consumed in flames so ferocious that between 100 and 500 souls perished, their screams swallowed by the roar of a firestorm that fed on timber-framed houses dried to kindling by months without rain. The Einbeck town fire was not an accident of carelessness or bad luck. It was the inevitable consequence of a drought so extreme, so prolonged, and so merciless that it would earn the title of the hottest summer in recorded European history. Chroniclers across the continent had already been writing in stunned disbelief for months. From February onward, the rains simply stopped. Springs dried up. Brooks vanished. Rivers that had carved their beds through stone over millennia shrank to trickles and then to nothing. And the heat, relentless, unforgiving, suffocating, pressed down upon the people of Europe like the lid of a vast oven, trapping them inside a furnace of their own familiar landscape turned alien and hostile. This was the mega-drought of 1540, and tonight you are going to live through every blistering, parched, desperate moment of it. Not as a historian reading about it centuries later, but as a person walking those cracked roads, breathing that scorched air, watching your well run dry and wondering if rain will ever fall again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you are listening from and what hour of the night has brought you here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You are living in the year 1540, and you are about to discover what happens when the sky forgets how to weep. Let us begin at the beginning, before anyone understood what was coming. The winter of 1539 had been unremarkable. Cold, yes, as winters tend to be in Central Europe. Snow fell in the Alps and dusted the rooftops of Zurich and Basel and Strasbourg. The Rhine flowed fat and gray between its banks. Cattle huddled in their byres. Peasants mended tools by firelight and waited for spring, as peasants had always done, as peasants always would. Nobody paid particular attention to the weather in January, because January weather in Europe was simply something you endured. You stacked your firewood, you patched your shutters, you ate your stored grain and salted meat, and you waited. But February came, and something shifted. You noticed it first in the way the morning air felt against your face when you stepped outside. There was a dryness to it, a crispness that did not belong to the season. February in the Rhineland should be damp. February should smell of wet earth and coming thaw. Instead, the air tasted like dust. You looked up at the sky and saw blue. Not the pale, watery blue of a winter clearing, but a hard, ceramic blue that seemed to stretch forever without a single wisp of cloud. You thought nothing of it. A dry spell, perhaps. They happen. You went about your business, feeding your animals, checking your stored supplies, wondering when the first green shoots of spring would push through the soil. By March, the dry spell had not broken. The ground beneath your feet was harder than it should have been. The puddles that normally collected in the ruts of the village road were absent. Your neighbor remarked upon it one morning as you both drew water from the communal well. The water level seemed lower than usual, he said, frowning down into the dark shaft. You agreed, but neither of you was worried. Not yet. March could be dry. April would bring the rains. April always brought the rains, except that April came and the rains did not. The sky remained that same hard, relentless blue. Day after day, you woke to sunshine. Not the gentle, nourishing sunshine of spring that coaxes seeds from the earth and turns the countryside green, but a fierce, aggressive sunshine that beat down upon the land like a hammer upon an anvil. The earth began to crack. Long fissures appeared in the fields, zigzagging between the rows of newly planted crops like the wrinkles on an old woman's face. The seedlings that had pushed hopefully through the soil in March began to wilt. Their leaves curled inward, turning from green to yellow to brown, as if autumn had arrived 5 months early. You watched the sky every morning, searching for clouds. You watched it every evening, hoping for the dark mass of an approaching storm. But the horizon remained clear, day after day, week after week. The old women of the village began to mutter about curses. The parish priest led prayers for rain, his voice rising and falling in the cool stone interior of the church, while outside, the sun blazed on, indifferent to human petition. In the Swiss city of Zurich, the reformer Heinrich Bullinger picked up his pen and began to record what was happening. He would later write that from February until the end of September, it never rained for a whole day or night, not once, not a single complete day of rainfall in 8 months. Bullinger was a careful man, a scholar who measured his words. If he said it did not rain, it did not rain. Meanwhile, in Basel, another chronicler named Fridolin Riffe was keeping his own records. Riffe counted exactly 3 rain spells between the beginning of summer and St. Martin's Day on the 21st of November. 3. And each of those spells lasted no more than 2 or 3 days, and even then, the rain was what Riffe dismissively called short and feeble, barely enough to settle the dust. Certainly not enough to fill a well or swell a stream or save a crop. The people of Basel looked at their river and saw it shrinking. They looked at their fields and saw them dying. And they began, slowly and then with increasing urgency, to understand that something unprecedented was happening. You stand at the edge of your village in early May, and you feel the heat like a physical weight upon your shoulders. It is not the heat of high summer. It is not supposed to be this hot. May should be mild, pleasant, the loveliest month of the European calendar. But this May belongs to a different world, a world where the normal rules have been suspended, where the familiar rhythms of weather and season have broken. Down like a wagon with a shattered axle. The sun rises each morning in a sky so clear it seems polished, and it does not set until it has wrung every last drop of moisture from the land. Your crops are struggling. The rye and wheat you planted with such hope in early spring are stunted, their stalks thin and pale. Without rain, the soil has become powder. You can pick up a handful and let it run through your fingers like sand. The vegetables in your kitchen garden, the cabbages, the turnips, the beans, droop in the heat despite your best efforts to water them from the well. But the well itself is a growing concern. Each morning, the bucket comes up a little less full, the water a little more murky. You have begun to ration, giving the animals first priority, because without them, you have no way to plow or haul or earn your living. Across Europe, the story is the same. From the vineyards of Burgundy to the wheat fields of Silesia, from the olive groves of northern Italy to the pastures of the Low Countries, the drought tightens its grip with each passing day. In the great cities, Paris, Cologne, Prague, Vienna, the effects are felt differently, but no less keenly. Urban wells run dry faster because more people draw from them. The rivers that serve as both water supply and waste disposal system shrink to sluggish, foul-smelling channels. In a world without modern sanitation, this is not merely unpleasant. It is dangerous. The connection between contaminated water and disease is not yet understood in 1540. People know that bad water can make you sick. Centuries of observation have taught them that much, but they do not understand why. They attribute illness to bad air, to miasma, to the alignment of the planets, to divine punishment for sin. And so, as the wells run low and the rivers turn green and stagnant, people continue to drink what is available because they have no choice. The alternative is to die of thirst. What they do not realize is that the water they are drinking is slowly killing them. Dysentery, typhoid, and a host of other waterborne diseases are brewing in those depleted, concentrated, contaminated water sources, and by summer they will begin to claim lives in numbers that will stagger even the most hardened chroniclers. But that is still weeks away. For now, in May, the immediate concern is the crops. You are a peasant farmer, and your entire existence depends on what the earth produces. A bad harvest means hunger. A failed harvest means starvation. And as you stand in your field, watching the wind lift dust devils from the bone-dry furrows, you are beginning to understand that this year's harvest is going to be very, very bad. The grain is not growing properly. Without water, it cannot fill its heads. The kernels, if they form at all, will be small and shriveled, yielding perhaps half or a third of what a normal year would produce. Your stomach tightens at the thought. You have a family to feed. You have rent to pay to your Lord, tithes to pay to the church. A poor harvest does not reduce these obligations. The Lord still wants his share. The church still wants its tenth. And what is left for you may not be enough to survive the winter. You are not alone in this fear. Every farmer in every village across Central Europe is doing the same grim arithmetic, staring at the same parched fields, praying to the same silent sky. The roads between villages carry worried travelers, men going to check on relatives in neighboring towns, women carrying water jugs to distant springs that have not yet dried up, itinerant peddlers who report that conditions are just as bad everywhere they have been. Nobody has seen anything like this. The oldest people in the village, men and women in their 70s who remember the droughts of the early 1520s, shake their heads and say this is worse, much worse. In the cities, the intellectual classes are also taking notice. Scholars and churchmen correspond with one another across great distances, sharing observations and theories. The reformer, Martin Luther, writing from Wittenberg, notes the unusual heat and interprets it through a theological lens. For Luther, as for many of his contemporaries, extreme weather is a sign from God, a warning or a punishment directed at a sinful humanity. The Catholics naturally see it differently, or rather, they see the same sign but read a different message. Where Luther sees God's displeasure with papal corruption, Catholic preachers see God's anger at the heresy of the Reformation. The drought, it seems, is a theological Rorschach test, and everyone reads in it a confirmation of what they already believed. But theology offers no practical solution to the problem of empty wells and dying crops. And so, the people of Europe do what people have always done. In times of crisis, they fall back on ritual and tradition. In Catholic regions, processions wind through the streets and out into the parched countryside. Priests carry relics of the saints, a finger bone here, a scrap of cloth there, held aloft in glittering reliquaries while the faithful follow behind, chanting litanies and praying for rain. In some places, the statue of the local patron saint is taken from the church and paraded through the fields, a desperate gesture of faith in a time when faith is all that remains. The processions are held on rogation days, the traditional days of prayer for good harvests, but this year they carry an urgency, a raw desperation that strips away the usual ceremonial dignity and leaves only the naked human need for water, for relief, for mercy. In Protestant regions, where such processions have been abolished as superstitious popery, the response is different but equally fervent. Congregations gather in their whitewashed churches for special days of prayer and fasting. Pastors preach sermons about the sins of the community, searching for the transgression that has provoked God's wrath. Could it be the drunkenness? The fornication? The failure to keep the Sabbath properly? The sermons grow longer and more intense as the drought deepens and the congregations sit in stifling heat, inside churches that trap the warmth like ovens, sweating through their wool and linen garments, praying with a fervor born of genuine terror. And still, the sky remains blue, and still, the sun beats down, and still, not a single drop of rain falls upon the cracked and desperate earth. June arrives, and with it comes a heat that makes everything that came before seem like a gentle prelude. You wake in the mornings now with your linen shirt already damp with sweat, stuck to your body like a second skin. The nights offer no relief. The thick stone walls of your cottage, which in winter hold the warmth of the fire and keep the cold at bay, now trap the heat of the day and radiate it back at you through the dark hours. You lie on your straw mattress and feel the heat pressing down upon you like a blanket you cannot throw off. Sleep comes in fitful snatches, broken by thirst and discomfort and the restless movements of your family members, all of them suffering in the same airless, suffocating darkness. By dawn, you are already exhausted and the day has not yet begun. You step outside and the heat hits you like opening the door of a bread oven. The air shimmers above the ground, creating ghostly mirages that dance and waver on the horizon. The grass, what little remains of it, has turned to straw. The trees along the road have begun to drop their leaves, shedding them weeks or months ahead of schedule in a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. They stand naked and skeletal against the blazing sky, their branches reaching upward like the arms of supplicants begging for water. The village pond, which in spring was a broad, shallow sheet of water where geese swam and children played, has shrunk to a muddy hollow. Its edges are cracked and curled, the dried mud breaking into tiles that lift and crumble underfoot. A few inches of greenish, stinking water remain in the center, and even this is claimed by the livestock, who stand in it belly deep, their heads hanging, their eyes dull with suffering. The well in the village square is now the focus of intense anxiety and increasingly bitter disputes. The water level has dropped so low that the bucket barely touches the surface, and what it brings up is cloudy and tastes of earth. Families who once drew water freely now count every bucketful. Arguments break out at the wellhead. Your neighbor accuses you of taking more than your share. You accuse him of the same. The village council meets and imposes rationing, so many buckets per household per day, no more. Armed watchmen are posted at the well at night to prevent theft. Theft of water, that is what it has come to. In a land famous for its rivers and rain, people are stealing water. The situation with the rivers is dire. You have heard reports brought by travelers and peddlers that beggar belief. The mighty Rhine, the great artery of European commerce that carries barges loaded with wine and timber and cloth from Basel to the sea, has fallen to levels never before seen. In places, the riverbed is exposed, vast expanses of mud and gravel, and stranded boats that lie on their sides like beached whales. Fishermen sit idle on the banks, their nets useless, watching their livelihood evaporate along with the water. The barges that still attempt to navigate the shallows scrape their hulls on the bottom and must reduce their loads to a fraction of normal capacity, driving up the cost of everything they carry. Further east, in the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Vltava River that flows through Prague has sunk so low that people walk across its bed. Imagine that. Walking across the bottom of a river, your feet crunching on gravel and dried mud where fish once swam. The citizens of Prague stand on the Charles Bridge, that magnificent stone structure with its line of saint statues gazing down, and they stare at the pitiful remnant of their river with a mixture of disbelief and dread. The Vltava is not some insignificant stream. It is a major European river, and it has been reduced to something you can wade across without getting your knees wet. To the south, Lake Constance, the Bodensee, is experiencing its own crisis. This vast lake, shared by the territories of modern Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, has dropped to its lowest level ever recorded. The drop is so dramatic that the island town of Lindau, normally separated from the mainland by a stretch of open water, finds itself connected by exposed lakebed. You can walk from the mainland to Lindau without getting your feet wet. It is as if the landscape itself is reshaping, the familiar geography of Europe distorting under the relentless pressure of the heat. And then there are the smaller waterways, the streams and brooks and springs that are the lifeblood of rural communities. These have simply vanished, dried up completely. The springs that have bubbled from hillsides since time immemorial, that generations of villagers have relied upon for drinking water, have gone silent. The brooks that once chattered through meadows and turned the wheels of mills are now dry channels, their beds lined with cracked mud and dead fish. The mills, those essential machines that grind the grain that makes the flour that bakes the bread that feeds the people, stand silent and useless. Without water to turn their wheels, they cannot grind. And without grinding, there is no flour. And without flour, there is no bread. And without bread, there is death. This is not a figure of speech. The price of bread is already climbing, not because there is no grain. The harvest has not yet fully failed, and there are still reserves from the previous year, but because there is no way to process it. The watermill was the engine of medieval food production, and the drought has shut it down. Some millers resort to hand grinding, using primitive quernstones to produce small quantities of coarse flour, but it is backbreaking work and produces a fraction of what the watermill could achieve. Others try to use windmills where they exist, but windmills are far less common in Central Europe than in the Low Countries. And in any case, the air is so still and heavy with heat that even the wind seems to have abandoned the continent. The price of a loaf of bread doubles, then triples. The poor, who already spent the majority of their income on food, begin to go hungry. And it is only June. Historians still argue whether the temperature records reconstructed from tree rings and ice cores fully capture the extremity of what happened in 1540, or whether the reality was even worse than the data suggests. What is not in dispute is that the heat was beyond anything in living memory. Beyond anything in the chronicles of the previous centuries, beyond anything that Europe would experience again until the famous heat wave of 2003. And even that, some researchers argue, was less severe than what happened in 1540. You are living through the worst of the worst, the absolute extreme of European climate, and you do not have air conditioning, refrigeration, piped water, or any of the other tools that modern people take for granted. You have a well that is running dry, a field that is turning to dust, and a sky that mocks you with its perfect, cloudless, merciless blue. July. The word itself feels inadequate to describe what this month brings. If June was the prelude to hell, July is hell itself, complete with fire and brimstone and the screams of the damned. The temperatures in Central Europe climb to levels that modern researchers estimate at 5 to 7 degrees Celsius above the 20th century average. In practical terms, this means daily highs well above 30 degrees, with peaks that may have exceeded 40. For a population accustomed to temperate summers in the low 20s, this is not merely uncomfortable. It is life-threatening. You feel it in your body first. The constant headaches, the dizziness when you stand too quickly, the dry mouth that no amount of water seems to quench, assuming you can get water at all. Your skin is burned and peeling from weeks of exposure to the relentless sun. Your lips are cracked and bleeding. Your eyes sting from the dust that fills the air, kicked up by every breeze, every footstep, every movement of an animal. The dust gets into everything, your food, your water, your bedding, your lungs. You cough constantly, a dry hacking cough that produces nothing but more irritation. The animals are suffering terribly. Your cattle stand in whatever shade they can find, their sides heaving, their tongues lolling. They have stopped producing milk, their bodies cannot spare the moisture. The chickens have stopped laying. The pigs lie motionless in their pens, barely breathing, their skin hot to the touch. Every day, somewhere in the village, an animal dies. The carcasses bloat quickly in the heat, swelling to grotesque proportions within hours, and must be dragged away and buried before they attract flies and spread disease. But the ground is so hard that digging a hole deep enough to bury a cow requires hours of backbreaking labor with pickaxes, and the men who do the work collapse from exhaustion and heat stroke. The smell is something you never forget. In a world without refrigeration, the heat accelerates the decay of everything organic. The dead animals, the human waste in the cesspit behind every house, the garbage that accumulates in the streets, the stagnant remnants of the village pond, all of it putrefies rapidly, producing a stench that hangs over the village like a visible miasma. People cover their faces with cloth when they venture outside, but the cloth itself is soon soaked with sweat and offers little protection. The flies are everywhere, breeding in the filth with mindless fecundity, swarming over food and faces and open wounds. This is the breeding ground for the epidemic that is about to sweep across Europe. In the towns and cities, conditions are worse. The concentration of population, combined with medieval sanitation practices that were barely adequate even in normal times, creates a perfect storm of filth and contamination. The rivers that cities depend upon for water are now low, sluggish, and horribly polluted. Raw sewage that would normally be carried away by strong currents now sits and ferments in the tepid shallows. People draw water from these rivers because they have no alternative, and within days of drinking it, they begin to sicken. The symptoms are unmistakable: violent stomach cramps, uncontrollable diarrhea, fever, dehydration. Dysentery, that ancient killer, stalks the streets of European cities with renewed vigor, finding in the contaminated water and weakened bodies of the drought-stricken population a perfect environment in which to flourish. The chroniclers begin to record deaths, not the dramatic, violent deaths of war or plague, but the quieter, more pitiful deaths of dehydration and waterborne disease. Old people, young children, the already sick, they die first. Then the apparently healthy begin to succumb. A man who seemed strong and vigorous in the morning is dead by nightfall, his body ravaged by fluid loss that his system cannot replace because there is not enough clean water to drink. Mothers watch their children die and cannot help them because there is nothing to give them. No clean water, no medicine, no relief from the heat that is cooking them alive. The death toll is impossible to calculate precisely. But modern historians estimate that approximately 500,000 Europeans died during the drought of 1540 and its immediate aftermath. 500,000 people. Think about that number. It is roughly equivalent to the entire population of a major medieval city like Paris or Constantinople. 500,000 people, dead from heat and thirst and contaminated water and the diseases that breed in desperation and filth. Historians still argue whether this figure is too conservative, whether the true death toll might have been even higher, lost in the gaps of incomplete medieval record-keeping and the chaos of a society in crisis. And amid all this suffering, the fires begin, not the natural wildfires of lightning strikes. There is no lightning because there are no storms. But fires of human origin, sparked by accident or carelessness in a landscape so desiccated that a single spark can ignite a conflagration. The thatched roofs of villages, the timber frames of townhouses, the wooden fences and barns and sheds, all of it is dry as paper after months without rain. A candle knocked over, a spark from a forge, a cooking fire that jumps from the hearth to the rushes on the floor. Any of these is enough to start a blaze that spreads with terrifying speed through a tightly packed settlement. 48 chroniclers across Europe record forest and settlement fires in 1540. Some of the forest fires burn for months, consuming thousands of hectares of woodland, sending columns of smoke into the sky that can be seen from miles away. The smoke adds another layer of misery to the already oppressive air, turning the sun a bloody red and making breathing even more difficult. At night, you can see the glow of distant fires on the horizon, an eerie orange light that flickers and pulses like the heartbeat of some vast, malevolent creature crouching beyond the edge of the world. In the German territories alone, fires destroy more towns and settlements in 1540 than in any other. Peaceful year since the year 1000. That is more than 5 centuries of recorded history, and 1540 stands at the top of the list like a grim champion, undefeated and unmatched. The connection between the drought and the fires is obvious to us, with our modern understanding of fire science and climate, but to the people living through it, the frequency and ferocity of the fires suggest something more sinister than mere coincidence. Someone, they reason, must be setting them deliberately. And with that reasoning, the stage is set for one of the darkest chapters of an already dark year, the arsonist paranoia. The paranoia begins as whispers. A house burns down in a town in Lower Saxony. Another fire breaks out in Thuringia 2 days later. A barn goes up in flames in Bavaria. Each fire, taken individually, is unremarkable. Fires are a constant hazard in a world of open flames and combustible building materials. But taken together in the context of the drought, they form a pattern that terrifies the population. Someone is doing this on purpose. Someone is setting fires to destroy Protestant towns, or Catholic towns, depending on which side you are on. The rumor spreads faster than the fires themselves. The concept of the Mordbrenner, the arsonist for hire, takes root in the popular imagination. According to the conspiracy theory, marginalized men, vagabonds, and beggars who exist on the fringes of society are being paid by agents of the opposing religious faction to set fires in enemy towns. Protestants accuse Catholic agents of organizing a campaign of arson against Reformation strongholds. Catholics accuse Protestant fanatics of doing the same in reverse. The accusations fly back and forth across the religious divide with increasing venom, and in the fevered atmosphere of the drought, they find fertile ground. The consequences are horrific. Vagabonds and beggars, already the most vulnerable members of society, become targets of suspicion and violence. Town councils issue decrees ordering all strangers to be watched, questioned, and if necessary, detained. Travelers who cannot provide a satisfactory account of themselves and their business are arrested and taken before magistrates. Under the legal norms of the time, interrogation means torture. And under torture, people confess to anything. To arson, to conspiracy, to having been paid by shadowy agents of the Pope or the Protestant princes to burn down towns they have never visited. The confessions, extracted under agony, are taken as proof that the conspiracy is real. This confirms the paranoia and intensifies the hunt. More vagabonds are rounded up, more confessions are extracted, more executions follow. The cycle feeds upon itself, each confession validating the theory and demanding further investigation, further arrests, further torture, further confessions. It is a textbook example of a moral panic driven by genuine fear and suffering, exploited by those in power and paid for in the blood of the weakest and most defenseless members of society. Even Martin Luther himself gives credence to the conspiracy. The great reformer, writing from Wittenberg, suggests that the fires are the work of agents provoked by the Pope, part of a deliberate campaign to destroy Protestant communities. Luther's voice carries enormous authority in the German-speaking world, and his endorsement of the arsonist theory lends it a legitimacy it does not deserve. When Martin Luther says the Pope's agents are burning down your towns, you believe it, and you act accordingly, rounding up anyone who looks like they might be a Mordbrenner and subjecting them to the full rigor of 16th century justice, which is to say, no justice at all. The irony, Of course, is that most of the fires need no human explanation. The drought has created conditions in which fire is almost inevitable. Buildings that have baked in the heat for months are tinderboxes, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. A blacksmith's forge sends sparks drifting over rooftops that have not seen rain since February. A kitchen fire, burning in a hearth surrounded by wooden walls and straw-strewn floors, needs only a moment's inattention to leap out of control. The fires are not the work of papal conspirators or Protestant saboteurs. They are the natural and predictable consequence of extreme heat and extreme dryness applied to a built environment of wood and thatch and straw. But rationality is an early casualty of fear, and in the summer of 1540, fear rules Europe as absolutely as the sun. You watch the arsonist panic from your village with a mixture of fear and unease. A stranger passes through one morning, a thin, ragged man with a bundle on his back and a haunted look in his eyes. He asks for water. You give him some grudgingly from your dwindling supply. He thanks you and moves on. That evening, your neighbor's barn catches fire, a candle left too near the hay, almost certainly, but the timing is suspicious. People begin to talk. Was it the stranger? Did anyone see where he went? Should someone go after him? The village buzzes with speculation and accusation, and you feel the dark current of mob justice stirring beneath the surface of your community, ready to sweep away any unlucky soul who happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is what drought does to people. It does not merely parch the land and kill the crops. It parches the soul and kills the bonds of community. It turns neighbor against neighbor, host against guest, the strong against the weak. It strips away the thin veneer of civilization and reveals the animal underneath, frightened, aggressive, desperate, looking for someone to blame. The heat has been building for 5 months now, and it has burned away not just the moisture in the soil, but the patience. It has to. The crops still need tending, even if they are dying. The animals still need feeding, even if feed is scarce. Children still need to be bathed and clothed and put to bed, even if the water for bathing is rationed and the bed sheets are soaked with sweat. The daily routines of medieval life continue with a grim determination that borders on heroism, ordinary people doing ordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, holding on to normalcy as if their grip on it is the only thing preventing them from sliding into chaos. Because it is. Women walk miles to distant springs that have not yet dried up, carrying heavy jugs back on their heads and hips, arriving home exhausted and drenched in perspiration, having lost almost as much moisture to their exertion as they have brought back in their vessels. Men dig deeper wells, pounding through sun-baked earth with iron tools, opening blisters on their palms and breaking their backs in the pursuit of water that may or may not exist below the surface. Old people sit in whatever shade they can find and tell stories of past droughts, none of which, they admit with widened eyes, was anything like this one. The children suffer most visibly. In a normal summer, they would be playing in the fields and streams, swimming in the village pond, climbing trees and chasing butterflies. But the fields are dust, the streams are dry, the pond is a toxic puddle, the trees are losing their leaves, and the butterflies have vanished. The children sit listlessly in doorways, too hot to play, too young to understand why the world has become so harsh and strange. They ask for water, and their mothers give them what they can, measuring out small cups from the family's daily ration with the careful precision of an apothecary dispensing medicine. And always the question, when will it rain? The answer to that question, as July grinds on, is not yet, not for a very long time. And as the heat intensifies to its peak, a new and peculiar phenomenon emerges that will define the summer of 1540 in European cultural memory: the wine. The vineyards of Europe, which stretch across the hillsides of the Rhine Valley, Burgundy, Franconia, and 100 other regions, are experiencing something unprecedented. The grapes, which normally ripen slowly through August and September, are reaching full maturity in early July. The sugar content in the berries is extraordinary, concentrated by the relentless sun and the absence of rain into levels that would astonish a modern winemaker. But there is a problem. The same heat that is ripening the grapes prematurely is also shriveling them on the vine. The berries are shrinking, their skins wrinkling, their flesh desiccating. In Würzburg, in the Franconian wine region, the vine growers face a dilemma. The grapes are ripe. Overripe, in fact, but they are the size of raisins. Harvesting them now will yield a small quantity of intensely sweet wine, almost like a dessert wine or a honey mead. but the vine growers are hoping for more rain, which would plump up the berries and increase the volume of the harvest, even if it dilutes the sweetness. And so they wait. They wait through July. They wait through the early part of August. The rain does not come. The grapes continue to shrivel. Finally, reluctantly, the vine growers begin to harvest what remains. What they produce is remarkable, a wine of extraordinary sweetness, rich and golden and thick as syrup, with an alcohol content far higher than normal. In Würzburg, this vintage will become legendary, known as the Kaiser wine, the emperor's wine, and it will be remembered as one of the finest wines ever produced in the region. A single bottle from the 1540 vintage of the Würzburger Stein vineyard will survive for centuries, carefully preserved in the cellars of the Burgerspittel, where it will become a curiosity and a treasure, a liquid memory of the year the sun nearly destroyed Europe. But the Kaiser wine is an aristocratic exception. For most of Europe, the wine harvest of 1540 tells a different story. The sheer volume of overripe grapes, combined with the desperation of the vine growers, produces not just fine wine, but vast quantities of cheap, sweet, potent wine that floods the market and drops the price to levels that even the poorest can afford. The previous year's vintage of 1539, an abundant but mediocre crop, is literally thrown into the gutters to make room for the new wine. People who have never been able to afford wine suddenly find themselves with access to unlimited quantities of the stuff, and they do what people throughout history have done when confronted with cheap alcohol and overwhelming misery. They drink. The chronicler Hermann von Weinsberg, writing in Cologne, records the scene with a mixture of disapproval and dark humor. People lie in the gutters and behind hedges, he writes, like pigs. The streets of Cologne are littered with the unconscious bodies of men and women who have drunk themselves insensible on the sweet, cheap wine of 1540. It is a peculiar kind of apocalypse, the end of the world not in fire and flood, but in drought and drunkenness. The people of Europe, unable to find water, drown themselves instead in wine. There is a desperate logic to it. Wine, unlike water, is safe to drink. The fermentation process kills the bacteria that make river water and well water dangerous. In a time when the water supply is contaminated and people are dying of dysentery, wine is not just an indulgence. It is a survival strategy. Of course, the people of 1540 do not understand the science behind this. They do not know about bacteria or fermentation or waterborne pathogens. They just know that the water makes them sick and the wine does not. And so they drink wine with their breakfast and wine with their dinner and wine in between. And the sweet, powerful vintage of 1540 makes this easier and cheaper than it has ever been. But alcohol has its own consequences. The drunkenness that von Weinsberg describes is not just a public nuisance. It is a public health crisis layered on top of an existing public health crisis. Drunk people make poor decisions. They neglect their children and their animals. They start fights. They knock over candles and start fires. They fall asleep in dangerous places and die of exposure, which in this context means not cold, but heat. A man who passes out drunk in the sun risks fatal heat stroke. A woman who drinks herself unconscious leaves her children unsupervised in a world full of hazards. The cheap wine of 1540 saves some lives by providing a safe alternative to contaminated water, but it costs others through the predictable consequences of mass intoxication. And so Europe in July of 1540 presents a bizarre tableau. A continent simultaneously dying of thirst and drowning in wine. Fields of dust and rivers of alcohol, the pious praying for rain while their neighbors lie drunk in the ditches, children crying for water while adults guzzle wine. It would be almost comic if it were not so tragic, and the chroniclers who record these scenes do so with a kind of stunned incredulity, as if they cannot quite believe what they are witnessing. Historians still argue whether the mass drunkenness was primarily a coping mechanism, a survival strategy, or simply an inevitable consequence of cheap alcohol meeting desperate circumstances. The truth, most likely, is all three. You taste the wine yourself. Your neighbor brings you a jug of it one evening, pressed from the grapes of a local vineyard that has been harvested early. It is unlike anything you have tasted before, thick, sweet, almost cloyingly rich, with a warmth that spreads through your chest and a potency that makes your head swim after just a cup. You drink it anyway. You drink it because the well water has a green tinge now and a smell that makes your stomach turn. You drink it because the sweetness is a rare pleasure in a world that has become very short on pleasure. You drink it because, for a little while, it makes you forget the cracked earth and the dead animals and the worry that gnaws at your insides like a rat. You drink it, and for a brief, blurry hour, the world feels almost bearable. August opens with the catastrophe that will come to symbolize the entire year, the burning of Einbeck. You hear about it days after it happens, when a traveler stumbles into your village with the news, on the 26th of July by the old Julian calendar, which corresponds to the 4th of August by the Gregorian reckoning. The prosperous brewing town of Einbeck in Lower Saxony was consumed by fire. The fire started near the center of town, though no one is certain exactly where or how. What is certain is that once it began, there was no stopping it. The buildings, their timbers baked dry by 5 months of relentless heat, caught fire as easily as stacked kindling. The flames leaped from roof to roof, driven by gusts of superheated air, creating a firestorm that consumed everything in its path. The people of Einbeck had no chance. There was no water to fight the fire. The wells were dry, or nearly so. The streams that might have supplied bucket brigades had vanished months ago. The only option was to run, and many did, fleeing through streets that were themselves on fire, dodging falling beams and collapsing walls, carrying children and whatever possessions they could grab in the seconds before their homes became infernos. Those who could not run, the old, the sick, the very young, the trapped, died in their houses. The estimates of the dead vary wildly, from a conservative 100 to a staggering 500. In a town whose population was probably only a few thousand, even the lower figure represents a devastating loss. 1 in 10, perhaps 1 in 5 of Einbeck's inhabitants perished in a single afternoon. The survivors stood in the surrounding fields and watched their town burn, their faces lit by the glow of the destruction, their eyes streaming, not from grief, though grief would come, but from the thick, acrid smoke that billowed skyward in a column visible for miles. Einbeck was famous for its beer. The town's brewers had developed a distinctive style of strong, dark beer that was exported across northern Germany and beyond, a beer so prized that in later centuries it would give its name to the style known as Bock. But on that August day, the breweries burned along with everything else. The great copper kettles melted in the heat, the stores of malt and hops went up in smoke, the wooden barrels cracked and split, their contents hissing into steam. Years of accumulated expertise and infrastructure were destroyed in hours, and the town would take decades to recover. The burning of Einbeck was not just a human tragedy, it was an economic catastrophe, the destruction of an entire industry that had been the pride and livelihood of the community. And yet Einbeck was not unique. It was simply the most dramatic example of a phenomenon that was repeating itself across the continent. In the German territories alone, 32 additional city fires were recorded in 1540, 32 towns and cities burning in a single year. Some were small, affecting only a few buildings. Others were devastating, consuming entire neighborhoods or whole settlements. The Einbeck fire was the largest and most deadly, but it was far from the only one. Europe was on fire, literally, and the fires were as much a symptom of the drought as the empty wells and dying crops. In the forests, the situation was equally dire. Without the usual summer rains to keep the undergrowth damp, the woodlands of Central Europe became vast reservoirs of fuel, waiting for a spark. And sparks came from charcoal burners who could not contain their kilns, from travelers who left campfires smoldering, from lightning strikes in the rare storms that skirted the edges of the high-pressure system dominating the continent. The forest fires that resulted were enormous, burning for weeks or months, consuming thousands of hectares, driving wildlife from their habitats, and filling the sky with smoke that darkened the sun and turned it a sullen red. 48 chroniclers record forest and settlement fires across Europe in 1540. This is not a comprehensive count. It reflects only those fires that were observed and documented by someone who happened to be keeping a written record. The actual number of fires must have been far higher, especially in rural areas where no chronicler was present and where fires could burn unchecked for days before anyone in authority even knew about them. The scale of destruction is almost impossible to quantify, but it was clearly immense, leaving scars on the landscape that would be visible for years. You watch the smoke from your village. To the west, a pall of gray-brown haze hangs over the horizon, marking the location of a forest fire that has been burning for over a week. Some days, the smoke is thick enough to obscure the sun, turning the daylight to a murky, apocalyptic amber. Other days, the wind shifts and the smoke blows elsewhere, leaving you with clear skies and the familiar, merciless sunshine. The smell of burning wood is constant, carried on whatever breeze stirs the heavy air. It mingles with the smells of decay and sewage and dust that have become the olfactory signature of this dreadful summer, creating a complex and deeply unpleasant bouquet that assaults your nostrils from waking to sleep. At night, the distant fires glow on the horizon like the campfires of an invading army, orange and red against the darkness. You stand outside your cottage and watch them, and you think about fire in a way you never have before. Fire has always been your friend, your servant. The fire in the hearth that cooks your food and warms your home, the fire in the forge that shapes your tools, the fire in the kiln that bakes your pottery. But now, fire has slipped its leash. It has gone from servant to master, from friend to enemy. It devours everything it touches and cannot be controlled because there is no water to control it with. You check your own thatch roof nervously, running your hand over the straw and feeling how dry and brittle it has become. One spark. That is all it would take. One spark and everything you have, your house, your animals, your stored food, your entire world, would be gone in minutes. You do not sleep well. The epidemic arrives in August, though it has been building since June. The waterborne diseases that have been incubating in contaminated wells and stagnant rivers reach critical mass. And what follows is a wave of sickness and death that sweeps across Europe with a grim efficiency that reminds some chroniclers of the Black Death itself, though the comparison is not quite apt. The Black Death was dramatic, sudden, terrifying in its speed. The epidemic of 1540 is different, slower, steadier, more insidious. It kills not with the shocking violence of bubonic plague, but with the grinding, degrading misery of dysentery and typhoid, diseases that strip their victims of dignity before they strip them of life. The symptoms are familiar to anyone who has lived through a cholera outbreak or a bad bout of food poisoning, magnified 100-fold by the absence of clean water and medical care. It begins with stomach cramps, sharp and sudden, doubling you over in the middle of whatever you are doing. Then comes the diarrhea, urgent and uncontrollable, driving you to the privy or the nearest ditch every few minutes, hour after hour, day after day. The fluid loss is catastrophic. Your body is expelling water it cannot afford to lose, and in a drought-stricken world where clean water is almost impossible to obtain, you cannot replace what you are losing. You become dehydrated with terrifying speed. Your skin becomes dry and papery. Your eyes sink into their sockets. Your lips crack and bleed. Your urine, what little there is, turns dark brown. Your heart races as your blood thickens, and your body struggles to maintain circulation. In a modern hospital, with intravenous fluids and antibiotics and careful monitoring, dysentery is rarely fatal. In 1540, it is a death sentence for many of its victims, particularly the very young and the very old. Children die within days, their small bodies unable to withstand the fluid loss. Old people, already weakened by the heat and by months of inadequate nutrition, succumb almost as quickly, but even healthy adults in the prime of life are vulnerable. The disease strips the strength from your body like a thief in the night, leaving you hollow-eyed and trembling, too weak to stand, too weak to eat, too weak to fight the infection that is destroying you from the inside. The chroniclers call it the Big Death, not because it rivals the Black Death in total mortality, but because of its extent and severity. It spreads through every level of society, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest burgher, because everyone drinks water and everyone's water is contaminated. The rich have no advantage here. Their wells are drying up too, and the water that remains is just as full of deadly microbes as the water drunk by the poor. Some wealthy households resort to drinking only wine, which, as we have noted, is safe because fermentation kills bacteria. But wine has its own problems, and in any case, there is not enough of it to replace water entirely, especially for bathing, cooking, and cleaning. In the cities, the death toll mounts with sickening speed. The chroniclers record hundreds of burials per week in the worst-hit towns. In some places, the dead accumulate faster than they can be interred. and bodies are left lying in the streets or stacked in churchyards, waiting for gravediggers who are themselves sick or dead. The stench of decomposition adds another layer to the already unbearable miasma, and the flies that swarm over the corpses carry disease to the living, creating a feedback loop of infection and death. You fall sick yourself in mid-August. The cramps wake you before dawn, and you know immediately what is happening because you have watched your neighbors go through it. For the next 3 days, you exist in a haze of pain and humiliation, your body voiding itself at both ends while your family does what it can to help, which is very little. Your wife gives you water, but the water is part of the problem, drawn from the same contaminated well that made you sick in the first place. You alternate between burning fever and violent chills, your body shaking uncontrollably beneath the sweat-soaked blanket. You are convinced you are going to die. But you do not die. You are young enough and strong enough to survive, barely. After a week, the worst of the symptoms begin to subside. You can keep food down again, though your appetite is gone. You can stand, though your legs tremble like those of a newborn colt. You can walk, though only slowly and with frequent rests. You have lost perhaps 20 pounds, and your face in the dim reflection of the water bucket is gaunt and hollow-eyed, almost unrecognizable. Your wife looks at you with concern, but also with relief. Others have not been so lucky. The old woman 3 houses down is dead. So is the blacksmith's youngest child, a girl of 4 who wasted away over 5 terrible days while her father stood helplessly by, his massive forge-hardened hands useless against an enemy he could not see or strike. The cooper at the end of the lane is dead. The widow who lived by the church is dead. The village has lost a dozen souls in the space of 3 weeks. And the survivors gather at the funerals with the dazed, shell-shocked look of people who have been subjected to more grief than they can process. The priest speaks the words of comfort, but his own voice is thin and reedy. He too has been sick, and he too has barely survived. Modern historians estimate that approximately 500,000 Europeans died during the drought of 1540 and its immediate aftermath, primarily from waterborne diseases. 500,000. The number is almost incomprehensible. To put it in perspective, it represents roughly 2 to 3% of the entire population of Europe at the time. Imagine waking up one morning and learning that 2 to 3% of everyone you know, every 50th person in your town, your church, your market, your family, has died. Not from war, not from plague, from water, from the absence of clean, safe water, the most basic requirement of human survival. Historians still argue whether this death toll was the most devastating aspect of the 1540 drought or whether the long-term economic consequences were even worse. The dead, at least, were beyond suffering. The living still had a long road ahead. As August bleeds into September, you begin to notice something strange happening in the landscape around you. Or rather, you notice the absence of something, the birdsong that has been the soundtrack of European mornings for as long as anyone can remember, has gone quiet. The fields, which should be loud with the chirping of crickets and the buzzing of bees, are eerily silent. The animals of the countryside, the hares and foxes and deer and badgers that populate the woods and hedgerows, have vanished. Some have died of thirst. Others have fled to wherever water can still be found, concentrating around the few remaining streams and springs in numbers that create their own problems of overcrowding and disease. The trees tell their own story of distress. By September, many deciduous trees across Central Europe have lost their leaves entirely, standing as bare as they would in January. The early leaf fall is a survival mechanism. The trees shut down their water-hungry leaves to conserve what little moisture remains in their roots and trunks. But it gives the landscape an unsettling, out-of-season appearance, as if time itself has become confused by the drought. Autumn has arrived before summer has ended, but it is not the golden, mellow autumn of turning leaves and harvest festivals. It is a premature, forced, desperate autumn, the landscape stripping itself bare, not in the natural cycle of the seasons, but in a frantic bid for survival. The harvest, such as it is, takes place in September. You go into your fields with your sickle and cut what has grown, though what has grown is barely worth the effort. The rye is thin and stunted, the heads half filled with small, hard kernels that rattle loosely in their husks. A normal harvest might yield 10 bushels per acre. This year, you are lucky to get 3. The wheat is even worse. In many places, it has failed entirely, the plants having died in the ground before they could set seed. The barley and oats have fared marginally better, being slightly more drought-resistant, but even these are well below normal yields. You gather what you can and stack it in your barn, looking at the pitiful pile with the cold eye of a man calculating survival. It is not enough to feed your family through the winter. Not enough to pay the Lord's rent and the church's tithe and still have something left for seed corn in the spring. You will have to buy grain, if you can find it and if you can afford it, which is doubtful because the price of grain has already doubled and will double again before winter sets in, or you will have to borrow, going to the local merchant or moneylender with your hat in your hand, taking on debt that you may never be able to repay, mortgaging your future for the simple necessity of not starving to death in the present. The situation is similar across Europe. The grain harvest of 1540 is a disaster, one of the worst in a century. Yields are down by half or more in most regions, and in some areas, the harvest has failed completely. The immediate effect is a surge in food prices that hits the poor hardest. Bread, the staple food of the European diet, becomes a luxury that many cannot afford. The market stalls that normally overflow with grain and flour and freshly baked loaves are sparse and expensive. Housewives count their coins and make agonizing choices: bread or fuel, food for the children or rent for the landlord. The mathematics of poverty is always cruel, but in 1540 it is sadistic. But if the grain harvest is a catastrophe, the grape harvest is a paradox. The vineyards that have suffered so terribly all summer, the shriveled berries, the stressed vines, the constant threat of destruction, produce in the end a crop of remarkable quality if reduced quantity. The grapes that survive the drought are intensely concentrated, their sugars and flavors compacted by dehydration into something approaching perfection. The wines produced from these grapes are among the finest in European history. In Alsace and Burgundy, in the Rhine Valley and Franconia, the vintage of 1540 is recognized as exceptional, sweet, powerful, complex, with a depth of flavor that reflects the extremity of the conditions under which it was produced. It is a curious thing, this gift from the disaster. Historians still argue whether the remarkable wines of 1540 were purely the product of natural conditions, or whether they also reflected the desperation and ingenuity of the vine growers, who may have innovated new techniques to cope with the drought and inadvertently stumbled upon methods that improved their wine. The late harvest style, leaving grapes on the vine until they partially raisin, was not new in 1540, but the drought may have popularized it and demonstrated its potential on a scale never before attempted. For the moment, however, the wine is more problem than blessing. The cheap, sweet, potent wine continues to flood the market, and the mass drunkenness that began in July shows no signs of abating. If anything, it intensifies as September brings the new vintage, which is even sweeter and stronger than the wine made from early harvested grapes. The streets of the cities stink of wine and vomit, as well as sewage and smoke, and the chroniclers record an increase in accidents, brawls, and domestic violence that they attribute directly to the widespread intoxication. You sit outside your cottage on a September evening and watch the sun go down. It sets earlier now than it did at the height of summer, and the lower angle of the light creates long shadows that stretch across the parched fields like grasping fingers. The air is still warm. It has been warm for so long that you have almost forgotten what cool air feels like. But there is a faint suggestion of change, a barely perceptible softening at the edges of the heat that hints at the possibility, however remote, of autumn. You hold that hint close to your heart, like a precious thing, a fragile seed of hope in a season that has been barren of it. Perhaps the worst is over. Perhaps the rain will come soon. Perhaps the nightmare is ending. You take a sip of wine. There is nothing else safe to drink, and you wait, and you hope. October comes, and with it comes a change, though not the change you have been praying for. The heat begins to relent, slowly and grudgingly, like a tyrant loosening his grip one finger at a time. The daytime temperatures drop from the savage highs of July and August to something merely oppressive. Mornings are almost bearable. Evenings bring a coolness that feels like a benediction after months of unbroken heat. But the rain does not come. The sky remains clear, day after day, week after week, as if someone has painted it blue and forgotten to add clouds. The drought continues. In the Swiss city of Basel, Fridolin Riffe notes in his chronicle that the third and last of the year's feeble rain spells occurs sometime before St. Martin's Day on the 21st of November. 3 rain spells in approximately 6 months, from early summer to late autumn. 3 brief, inadequate episodes of precipitation in half a year. It is a statistic that seems almost impossible, the kind of number you would associate with a desert, not with the green heart of Europe. And yet, it is true, documented by a careful observer with no reason to exaggerate, a man who was simply recording what he saw and experienced. The landscape in October is a study in desolation. The fields that should be brown with freshly turned earth after the autumn plowing are instead gray and hard, too dry and compacted for the plow to penetrate. The orchards that should be heavy with apples and pears bear fruit that is small, wrinkled, and often rotten at the core. The forests, stripped of their leaves months ago, stand in skeletal silence, their bare branches casting thin, sharp shadows on the dusty ground. The rivers and streams that should be swelling with autumn rains remain at their summer lows, sluggish and polluted. The upper Rhine, that great commercial highway, has fallen to its lowest level ever recorded. This is not just an inconvenience for navigation. It is a crisis for the entire economy of the Rhine Valley. The barges that carry goods between Switzerland and the North Sea are stuck. Those that attempt the journey must carry barely a fraction of their normal load to avoid running aground, which makes every shipment many times more expensive. The cost of wine from Alsace, of timber from the Black Forest, of cloth from the Low Countries, all of it soars as transportation costs multiply. The drought is not just destroying crops, it is strangling trade. In the cities, the economic consequences are beginning to bite. Craftsmen who depend on water for their trades, tanners, dyers, fullers, papermakers, have been idle for months. Their workshops stand empty, their apprentices dismissed, their customers turned away. The ripple effect touches every corner of the urban economy. The tanner who cannot work cannot pay his rent. The landlord who does not collect rent cannot pay his taxes. The tax collector who comes up short cannot fund the city's obligations. The chain of economic dependency that holds medieval society together is weakening link by link, stressed by a drought that disrupts not just agriculture, but the entire fabric of commercial life. You notice the effects in small ways. The traveling merchants who normally visit your village every few weeks have become scarce. When they do appear, their packs are lighter and their prices higher. A length of cloth that cost you a certain amount last year now costs half again as much. Salt, that essential preservative without which you cannot keep meat through the winter, has become shockingly expensive because the salt barges on the rivers cannot carry full loads. You begin to calculate not just whether you have enough food to survive the winter, but whether you have enough of everything else. Enough salt to preserve what meat you have, enough fuel to heat your cottage, enough seed corn to plant in the spring. The fuel situation is particularly worrying. Normally, you would be gathering firewood from the forest now, building up the stockpile that will keep your family warm through the cold months, but the forests have been ravaged by fire. Many of the trees closest to your village are burned or dead, their wood reduced to charcoal and ash. Those that survive are weakened and may not survive the winter. You range further and further from home in search of usable timber, competing with your neighbors for a dwindling resource. Disputes over firewood, like disputes over water, become sources of tension and conflict within the community. The drought is fraying the social fabric of your village, pulling at threads that have held people together for generations. And yet there is resilience too. In every crisis, there are those who find ways to adapt, to improvise, to survive. The miller whose watermill has stood idle for months experiments with a horse-driven mechanism, hitching his old plow horse to a shaft connected to the grinding stones and producing flour by animal power instead of water power. It is slower and less efficient, but it works, and the families who depend on him for their bread are grateful. The woman who walks 3 miles each day to a spring that has not yet dried up begins to charge her neighbors a small fee for carrying water, turning her daily ordeal into a modest business that helps her survive. The local brewer, whose business has collapsed because there is no water to brew with, pivots to selling the cheap wine that floods the market, becoming a wine merchant by necessity, if not by choice. These small acts of adaptation and enterprise are the unsung heroics of the 1540 drought. They will not make it into the chronicles or the history books. No one will write about the miller's horse-driven grinding mechanism or the water carrier's entrepreneurial spirit. But they are the reason that communities survive, the reason that the social fabric, though stretched and frayed, does not tear apart entirely. Humans are adaptable creatures. Even in the worst of times, they find ways to keep going, to solve problems, to help each other, however imperfectly and reluctantly. The drought of 1540 tests this adaptability to its limit, but it does not break it. Not quite. Not yet. November arrives, and at last, at long, agonizing last, the weather begins to shift. The first real rain falls sometime in the second half of the month, and when it comes, it is not the gentle shower that the parched earth needs, but a heavy, driving downpour that hammers the hardened ground and runs, off in muddy torrents instead of soaking in. The soil, baked to the consistency of pottery by 9 months of uninterrupted heat, has lost its ability to absorb water. The rain that should have been salvation becomes a different kind of problem, flash floods that race through dry riverbeds, sweeping away anything in their path, while the deeper layers of the earth remain as dry as ever. You stand outside in the rain and let it fall on your upturned face. The sensation is so unfamiliar, so almost forgotten, that it brings tears to your eyes. You have not felt rain on your skin since February. 9 months. 9 months of cloudless skies and burning sun and cracked earth and dying crops and contaminated water and sickness and death and fire and fear. And now, finally, the sky is weeping, and so are you. Around you, other villagers have emerged from their cottages to stand in the downpour, and some of them are laughing, and some are crying, and some are doing both, and the rain soaks through their clothes and runs down their faces, and pools around their feet in the dust that is rapidly turning to mud, but the relief is mixed with a new kind of worry. The rain, when it comes in November, is too late to save the crops that died months ago. It is too late to fill the wells that dried up in the summer. It is too late for the 500,000 people who died of waterborne diseases and heat-related illnesses. It is too late for the towns that burned, for the forests that were consumed, for the livestock that perished. The rain is welcome, desperately welcome, but it cannot undo what has been done. It can only begin the long, slow process of healing that will take months or years, or in some cases, decades. The wells begin to refill, slowly, grudgingly. The springs that vanished in the summer begin to trickle again, though their flow is weak and uncertain, as if they are not quite sure the drought is truly over. The rivers rise marginally, enough to float small boats, but not enough to restore normal commerce. Lake Constance begins to creep back toward its normal level, though it will take the entire winter and much of the following spring to recover fully. The landscape, stripped bare by heat and fire, begins the tentative first steps of regeneration. Where the soil has not been too badly damaged, grass begins to sprout. Pale, thin, fragile green shoots pushing up through the mud like tiny flags. Surrender planted by a defeated army in reverse. But the human recovery is slower and more painful than the ecological one. The villages and towns that survived the drought are weakened, depleted, traumatized. The population has been reduced by disease and death. The livestock herds have been decimated. The food stores are dangerously low. The winter that is now approaching, normal, cold European winter, will be especially hard for communities that have already been stripped of their reserves by 9 months of drought. There is not enough grain. There is not enough salt-preserved meat. There is not enough firewood, because so much of it was destroyed in the summer fires. You sit by your hearth fire, a small, carefully rationed fire, because wood is precious now, and you do the calculations that every peasant family in Europe is doing this November. How much food do you have? How long will it last? What can you supplement with foraged roots and nuts and whatever else the blighted countryside can provide? How many months until the new crops come in, assuming you can even plant them? The arithmetic is grim. You will need to borrow grain from the Lord's stores or buy it at the extortionate prices that merchants are charging. Either way, you will start the new year in debt, a hole from which it may take years to climb out. The Lord himself is not immune to the crisis. His rents are down because his tenants cannot pay in full. His own domain lands have produced a fraction of their normal yield. His expenses have increased because he has had to repair fire damage and maintain order during the disturbances of the summer. Even the local monastery, normally a bastion of self-sufficiency with its extensive lands and careful husbandry, is feeling the strain. The monks' gardens are ruined. Their fish ponds are dry, their stores of grain and wine, while better than those of the peasants, are significantly depleted. The church offers what comfort it can. Advent is approaching, the season of waiting and hope that precedes Christmas, and the parish priest tries to frame the suffering of the past year within a theological narrative of trial and redemption. God tested his people, the priest says, as he tested Job. The drought was a trial of faith, and those who endured it with patience and piety will be rewarded. It is cold comfort to the families who lost children to dysentery, to the farmers whose fields are bare, to the tradesmen whose businesses have collapsed. But it is all the comfort available, and the people accept it because they have no alternative, because the structure of faith and meaning that the church provides is the only framework within which they can make sense of what has happened to them. The drinking continues, though. The cheap sweet wine of 1540 is still abundant, and as winter closes in and the darkness deepens, many people turn to it for warmth and oblivion. The taverns do brisk business, the only businesses that are thriving in this devastated economy. You stop by the village tavern some evenings, sitting in a corner with a cup of the too sweet wine, listening to the talk of your neighbors. The talk is mostly about survival, who has enough food, who needs help, who is planning to leave and seek work in a distant town or city. But there is also anger, a simmering resentment directed at the Lord who still demands his rent, at the church that still demands its tithe, at the merchants who are profiting from the crisis by charging outrageous prices for basic necessities. The anger is not confined to your village. Across Europe, the aftermath of the 1540 drought is marked by social tension and unrest. The gap between the rich and the poor, always wide in medieval and early modern society, has been widened further by the crisis. The poor have suffered disproportionately, as they always do in disasters. They had less food to begin with, less money to buy water or wine when the wells ran dry, less access to medical care when the diseases struck, less political power to influence the decisions that affected their lives. They did the dying, and now they are expected to do the paying, meeting their obligations to Lord and Church out of resources that have been devastated by forces entirely beyond their control. The lords and landowners, for their part, are not entirely unsympathetic. Many reduce rents or defer payments, recognizing that squeezing their tenants too hard in a crisis year will only drive them off the land or into rebellion. But there are limits to aristocratic generosity, and some lords, those who are themselves in financial difficulty, or those who are simply greedy or indifferent, insist on full payment regardless of circumstances. The resulting conflicts, while rarely escalating to open revolt, add another layer of bitterness to an already bitter time. In the cities, the guild structures that organize economic life are under strain. The master craftsmen who run the guilds are worried about their own survival and are not inclined to be flexible about rules and traditions that govern who can work and what they can charge. Journeymen and apprentices, many of whom have been idle for months because their trades depend on water that is not available, agitate for relief. The city councils, caught between the demands of the guilds and the needs of the unemployed, try to navigate a path through the crisis that satisfies no one. You hear stories of disturbances in distant towns. A group of journeyman tanners in Strasbourg has petitioned the council for emergency relief and been refused. In Augsburg, the price of bread has risen so high that a mob of women has marched on the market square, demanding that the city intervene to control prices. In Basel, the council has opened the city granaries and is selling grain at below-market prices, a measure that wins the gratitude of the poor but infuriates the merchants who were counting on profiting from the scarcity. The tensions are real, and they remind you, if you needed reminding, that the drought of 1540 is not just a natural disaster, but a social one, a force that exposes and exacerbates the inequalities and injustices that are built into the structure of European society. But winter also brings a different kind of stress: the cold. After 9 months of unremitting heat, the return of normal winter temperatures should be a relief, and in some ways it is. The risk of fire diminishes as the air grows damp. The waterborne diseases that ravage the population slow their spread as temperatures drop and water sources begin to recover. The insects that plague the summer, the flies, the mosquitoes, the lice, retreat or die off. The stench that hung over every village and town begins to dissipate as the cold air inhibits the decomposition of organic matter. But the cold also brings new dangers for a population that has been weakened by months of deprivation. People who survived the heat and the disease now face the prospect of a winter without adequate food or fuel. The firewood shortage is acute, especially in areas where forests have burned. Families huddle together in their cottages, sharing body heat, burning every scrap of combustible material they can find: broken furniture, old tools, dried animal dung. The cold that kills less dramatically than the heat, slowly, quietly in the night, claims its own victims among the old and the frail and the very young. You wrap yourself in every blanket and garment you own and lie by the fire, which you keep as small as possible to conserve wood. Your children sleep piled together like puppies, their small bodies sharing warmth. Your wife coughs, a persistent, rattling cough that she has had since her bout with dysentery in September, a cough that worries you because it has not improved and because you have seen what happens to people who cough like that through a hard winter. You do not speak of your worry aloud, but it sits in your chest like a stone, a cold weight that even the wine cannot dissolve. Outside, the first frost of the year silvers the ground. You look at it through the window, the small, unglazed opening in the wall that serves as a window, covered with oiled linen that lets in a dim, milky light, and you feel a complex emotion that is part relief and part dread. The drought is ending. The long nightmare of heat and thirst and fire is giving way to the normal cold of winter. But winter brings its own hardships, and after the year you have had, you are not sure you have the strength to face them. You take a breath, and the air is cold and clean and damp, and it tastes so different from the dusty, smoky, overheated air of the past 9 months that you almost do not recognize it. You breathe in again, deeply, filling your lungs with the cold air, feeling it sting the back of your throat. It is uncomfortable, but it is also wonderful. It is the taste of change, of seasons turning, of the earth remembering what it is supposed to do. You hold the cold air in your lungs and you think, we survived. We survived the worst of it. Whatever comes next, whatever the winter brings, we have already endured the worst year that anyone can remember. You hope you are right. December brings darkness and cold and the slow, tentative beginning of recovery. The rain that arrived in November continues intermittently through the last month of the year, each shower a small deposit in the vast deficit that the drought has created. The wells are rising, slowly but perceptibly. Each morning, the bucket comes up a little fuller, the water a little clearer. It is not safe to drink yet. The contamination that built up over months of low water levels has not been flushed away, but it is improving. You still drink wine when you can get it, and boiled water when you must, though you do not understand why boiling helps. You just know that your grandmother always insisted on it during times of sickness, and your grandmother lived to be 73, which in this world is a very long time. Christmas approaches, and with it comes the need for celebration, however muted. The church is decorated with whatever greenery can be found, holly and ivy mostly, since the deciduous trees are bare. The parish priest prepares his sermon, which will focus on the theme of hope and renewal, on the birth of a Savior in a time of darkness and despair. It is a message that resonates powerfully this year. The congregation that gathers on Christmas Eve is smaller than last year's. The empty spaces in the pews mark the absence of those who died, of disease, of heat, of fire, of the accumulated miseries of a year without rain. You attend the service with your family. The church is cold. Stone churches are always cold in winter, but after the suffocating heat of the past 9 months, the chill is almost welcome. You sit in your usual spot and look around at your neighbors. They look older than they did a year ago, thinner, harder. The faces that were round and ruddy last Christmas are now gaunt and lined, the skin stretched tight over cheekbones that protrude more than they should. The children who fidgeted and whispered through last year's service sit quietly now, their eyes too large in their thin faces, their restless energy burned away by months of heat and hunger and fear. The priest speaks, and his words echo in the stone vault above your head. He speaks of the star that guided the wise men, of the promise of redemption, of God's love that endures even in the darkest times. You listen, and you want to believe, and perhaps you do believe, because what else is there? The drought was not a punishment. You cannot accept that, not when it killed children who had committed no sin. But perhaps it was a test, and perhaps you passed it, and perhaps the new year will bring rain and recovery and a return to the normalcy that now seems like a distant dream. After the service, you share a modest Christmas meal with your family. It is nothing like the feast of past years. There is no roasted goose, no fresh bread, no honeyed cakes. Instead, there is a thin stew made from dried vegetables and a small piece of salt. Pork that you have been saving for this occasion, supplemented by coarse bread made from the meager grain harvest. There is wine. Of course, there is always wine this year, and you allow yourself an extra cup in honor of the day. Your children receive small gifts, a carved wooden horse for your son, a rag doll for your daughter. They are pleased, and their pleasure makes your heart ache with a fierce, protective love that the drought has sharpened to a point. Outside, the wind blows cold from the north, carrying the scent of snow. Snow. You had almost forgotten what it was like. The first flakes begin to fall as the evening deepens, drifting down from a gray sky in lazy, spinning spirals. They land on the dusty, scarred earth and melt instantly, but as the temperature drops, they begin to stick, laying a thin white blanket over the tortured landscape. You step outside and watch the snow fall, and there is something healing about it, something cleansing. The snow covers the cracked earth, the fire-blackened stumps, the dried-up stream beds, the scars of the worst year in memory. It does not erase them, but it hides them for a while, and sometimes hiding is the first step toward healing. The children come out to catch snowflakes on their tongues, and you let them, even though it is cold and they should be inside. You let them because they have had so little joy this year, and because the sight of them laughing with their mouths open to the sky, catching snowflakes like tiny white butterflies, is the most beautiful thing you have seen in months. You stand in the doorway and watch them, and the snow falls on your hair and your shoulders, and the cold seeps into your bones, and you feel, what? Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But something like the memory of happiness, a faint echo of the contentment you once felt, a whisper that says, this too shall pass. The drought is over, spring will come, the fields will be green again, the wells will be full, life will return to normal, or something close to normal, something bearable. You call the children inside and close the door against the cold. The fire crackles in the hearth, small but warm. Your wife hands you a cup of wine, and you sit together in the firelight, listening to the wind outside, feeling the cottage around you like a shell, fragile but intact. You survived the hottest summer in recorded history. You survived the fires and the disease and the thirst and the fear. You are alive. Your family is alive, and it is Christmas, and outside the snow is falling and the earth is beginning at last to drink. The new year of 1541 arrives, and with it comes a cautious optimism that is tempered by the knowledge of what has been lost. The immediate crisis is over, the rain has returned, the temperatures have normalized, the epidemic has subsided, but the long-term consequences of the drought will unfold over months and years, reshaping the economy, the society, and the psychology of an entire continent. The most immediate problem is food. The failed harvest of 1540 means that grain supplies are dangerously low, and the prices that began rising in the summer show no sign of coming down. The markets that normally bustle with vendors selling bread and meat and vegetables are sparse and expensive. What food is available is often of poor quality, grain that was harvested too early or stored improperly, meat from animals that were slaughtered because they could no longer be fed. The hungry time, that period in late winter and early spring when the previous year's stores are running out and the new crops have not yet come in, will be especially severe this year. People who barely survive the drought may not survive the famine that follows it. You tighten your belt, literally because you have lost weight, and the leather belt that once fit snugly around your waist now has 2 extra holes punched in it. Your family eats 1 meal a day instead of 2, and that meal is smaller and plainer than it should be. You stretch what you have with foraged foods. Acorns ground into a bitter flour, roots dug from the frozen earth, dried berries saved from the autumn. It is not enough. Your children are constantly hungry, their bellies round and distended in the telltale way that indicates malnutrition. Your wife, who is nursing an infant born in October, a child conceived in the early months of the drought, carried through the worst of it, born into the exhausted aftermath, struggles to produce enough milk because her own body is depleted. The livestock situation is equally dire. The herds that sustained your village, the cattle that pulled the plows and gave milk, the pigs that provided meat, the chickens that laid eggs, have been devastated. Many animals died during the summer. Others were slaughtered early because there was nothing to feed them. The breeding stock that should ensure next year's herds has been reduced to a fraction of its former size. Rebuilding the herds will take years, and in the meantime, the village must manage with fewer animals, less milk, less meat, less manure for the fields. The interconnected systems of medieval agriculture, in which animals and crops support each other in a cycle of mutual benefit, have been disrupted at every point. Spring comes eventually, as it always does, and with it comes the planting season. You walk into your fields in March with a sack of precious seed corn, purchased at ruinous prices from a merchant in the nearest town, paid for with money you borrowed at interest rates that would make a modern loan shark blush. And you begin to sow. The earth is softer now, moistened by winter rain and spring thaw, and the plow bites into it properly for the first time in over a year. The smell of turned earth, rich and dark and alive, brings tears to your eyes. You had forgotten what living soil smells like. After months of dust and ash and cracked clay, the scent of real, moist, fertile earth is intoxicating, better than any wine. You sow the seed and cover it and pray. You pray that the rain will come this year, that the sun will be kind, that the seasons will behave as they should. You pray with a fervor that comes from having seen what happens when the weather turns against you, a fervor born not of theological conviction, but of raw, visceral experience. You know now, in a way that you did not know before, how thin the margin is between survival and catastrophe, how utterly dependent your life is on forces that you cannot control or even understand. The people of 1540 did not know about high-pressure systems or jet streams or soil moisture feedback loops. They did not know why the rain stopped or why the heat was so extreme. They knew only that it happened, and that it nearly destroyed them, and that it could happen again. Historians still argue whether the drought of 1540 was truly a unique event or whether it was part of a broader pattern of climate variability that characterized the early modern period. Some researchers point to the evidence of tree rings and ice cores and suggest that the decade from 1531 to 1540 was the driest decade of the past 5 centuries in Central Europe. Others focus on the 1540 event itself, arguing that it was a black swan, an outlier so extreme that it cannot be explained by normal climate patterns. What is not in dispute is that it was unprecedented in its severity and its impact, a catastrophe that tested the resilience of European society to its breaking point and, in many communities, beyond. But resilience prevailed. The crops of 1541, blessed by more normal weather, produced a reasonable harvest, not a bumper crop, not a feast after the famine, but enough to feed the reduced population. Enough to begin rebuilding the depleted stores, enough to make the first payments on the debts incurred during the crisis, enough to survive, which was all that anyone asked for. The wells refilled, the rivers rose, the mills began to turn again, their great wooden wheels churning the water and grinding the grain and producing the flour. That would become the bread that would keep people alive. The rhythm of rural life, disrupted so catastrophically by the drought, began to reassert itself. Each familiar task and routine a small act of defiance against the chaos that had threatened to overwhelm everything. As the immediate crisis recedes, the people of Europe begin to reckon with what happened to them. This reckoning takes many forms: theological, practical, emotional, legal, and it will shape the culture and politics of the continent for years to come. The theological response is the most public and the most contentious. In a world where weather is widely understood as an expression of divine will, the question of why God sent the drought is not merely academic. It is urgent, personal, and deeply political. The Catholic Church frames the drought as divine punishment for the spread of heresy. The Reformation, which has been tearing Christendom apart for 2 decades, has provoked God's wrath, and the drought is the proof. Return to the true faith, the Catholic preachers urge, and God will restore the rains. The Protestant reformers naturally see it differently. The drought is God's judgment not on heresy, but on the corruption of the Roman Church, on the indulgences and the simony and the worldly ambitions of the papacy. Reform the Church, the Protestants argue, and the suffering will end. Both sides are wrong, of course, but neither side knows that. The real causes of the 1540 drought lie in the complex interactions of atmospheric pressure systems, ocean currents, and solar activity, forces that 16th century Europeans cannot observe, much less understand. A persistent high-pressure system, probably linked to broader patterns of atmospheric circulation, settled over Central Europe in late winter and refused to budge for the better part of a year, blocking the moisture-laden air masses from the Atlantic that normally bring rain to the continent. The result was the longest and most severe drought in European recorded history, a meteorological event of extraordinary rarity and devastating consequence. But meteorology is a science that will not exist for another 2 centuries, and in 1540, the only explanatory framework available is theology. God did it. The question is why, and the answer depends on who you ask. The theological debate over the meaning of the drought feeds into the broader conflict of the Reformation, adding another grievance to an already long list of grievances, another weapon to an already well-stocked arsenal of mutual accusation. Protestants and Catholics blame each other for provoking God's anger, and the blame game intensifies the sectarian hostility that will eventually culminate in the wars of religion that devastate Europe in the late 16th and 17th centuries. There is also a legal reckoning. The arsonist panic of the summer, with its false confessions extracted under torture and its scapegoating of vagabonds and outsiders, has left a legacy of injustice that some communities try to address. In a few places, magistrates review the convictions and conclude that the confessions were unreliable, that the fires were likely caused by the drought rather than by deliberate arson, that innocent men were tortured and executed for crimes that were never committed. These reviews are rare and they are quietly conducted because no one wants to admit publicly that the justice system failed so spectacularly. But they happen, and they represent a small, flickering light of reason in the darkness of superstition and fear. For most people, however, the reckoning is personal and private. You do not think about theology or meteorology or jurisprudence. You think about your dead neighbors, your ruined fields, your depleted animals, your hungry children. You think about the night the barn next door caught fire, and you stood in the yard with a bucket of precious water, debating whether to use it to fight the flames or to save it for drinking. You think about the day your daughter was so sick with dysentery that you were sure she was going to die, and you sat by her bed and promised God anything, if He would just let her live. She lived, others did not. Why her and not them? There is no answer that satisfies, and the question haunts you in the small hours of the night, when the fire has died down and the cottage is dark and cold and silent. The psychological impact of the drought is something that no chronicler adequately records, because the vocabulary and concepts for discussing psychological trauma do not yet exist. But the impact is real. People who lived through the summer of 1540 carry the experience with them for the rest of their lives, like a scar that aches in certain weather. They become cautious, hoarding food and water even in years of plenty. They become anxious, watching the sky for signs of drought with a vigilance that their children and grandchildren will find puzzling. They develop a relationship with weather that is more intense, more personal, more fearful than it was before, a relationship in which every cloudless day is a potential threat and every rainstorm is a gift. Historians still argue whether the psychological aftermath of the 1540 drought contributed to the broader cultural anxiety that characterized the late 16th century. The witch panics, the religious wars, the obsessive concern with sin and punishment that pervaded the art and literature of the period. The connection is difficult to prove, but it is suggestive. A population that has been traumatized by a catastrophe it cannot explain or prevent is a population that is primed for fear, for scapegoating, for the irrational violence of the witch trial and the religious persecution. The drought of 1540 may have poisoned the psychological soil of Europe, as surely as it poisoned the physical soil, creating conditions in which the weeds of intolerance and cruelty could flourish. But that is a story for another night. Tonight, you are recovering. The fields are green, the wells are full, the children are fed, if not fat. The village is rebuilding, slowly, painfully, but persistently. And you are learning, without knowing it, a lesson that every generation must learn for itself, that the earth is not a servant, but a master, that the weather is not a backdrop but a protagonist, that the thin line between civilization and chaos is drawn in water, and when the water runs out, the line disappears. Let us step back from your village for a moment and look at the bigger picture, the continental scale of what happened in 1540. Because while you were fighting to survive in your small corner of the Rhine Valley, similar scenes were playing out across an area of 2 to 3 million square kilometers, from the Atlantic coast of France to the plains of Poland, from the London Basin in England to the olive groves of northern Italy. In France, the drought struck the wine country with particular severity. The vineyards of Bordeaux and Burgundy, Champagne and the Loire Valley all suffered from the same punishing combination of heat and waterlessness that devastated the German and Swiss vineyards. French chroniclers record rivers running dry, forests burning, and livestock perishing in the fields. The Seine, that graceful river that winds through Paris and gives the city much of its character, shrank to a fraction of its normal volume. People could wade across it without getting their clothing wet above the knee, a spectacle that drew crowds of gawking Parisians to the riverbanks. The fishermen and boatmen who made their living on the Seine found themselves stranded, their boats tilted on the exposed mud, their nets drying in the sun. In England, the effects were felt primarily in the south and east, in the London Basin and the home counties. English chroniclers record a hot, dry summer with failed crops and water shortages, though the impact was somewhat less severe than on the continent, perhaps because England's maritime climate moderated the extremes somewhat. Still, the drought was serious enough to cause concern, and the prayers for rain that were offered in English churches echoed those being said in every language from Lisbon to Krakow. Italy presented its own distinctive picture. The northern Italian plains, the great agricultural heartland of the Po Valley, baked under the same relentless sun that scorched Germany and France. The Po itself, normally a wide, powerful river, dwindled to a shadow of itself, its flow reduced by an estimated 90%. The irrigation systems that had been developed over centuries to water the rice paddies and grain fields of Lombardy and the Veneto became useless when there was no water to irrigate with. The crop failures in northern Italy contributed to food shortages that rippled through the urban economies of Milan, Venice, and Florence, cities that depended on the surrounding countryside for their sustenance. Further east, in the lands that are now the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland, the drought was equally devastating. In Silesia, one of the breadbaskets of Central Europe, there was practically no rain for 6 months. The streams dried up entirely, and the river Oder, that great waterway that connects the interior of Poland to the Baltic Sea, dropped to levels so low that its water turned green with algae, becoming not just useless for navigation, but actively dangerous to drink. Cattle that were driven to the river to drink sickened and died, their bloated carcasses adding another source of contamination to already poisoned waters. In Bohemia, the Vltava's dramatic reduction to a walkable stream was just one symptom of a broader crisis. The hop gardens that supplied Prague's famous breweries withered in the heat. The fish ponds that dotted the Bohemian countryside, artificial lakes created over centuries by industrious monks and landowners to provide a reliable source of protein, dried up, their fish gasping and dying in the mud. The salt mines of the region, which depended on water for extraction and processing, slowed or stopped production, adding salt to the growing list of scarce commodities. The scale of the disaster is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. Accustomed as we are to weather events that are localized and temporary, the 1540 drought was neither. It covered an area roughly equivalent to the entire European Union and lasted for the better part of a year. There was no escape from it, nowhere to flee, no region to migrate to, no government agency to call for aid. If you were a peasant in Franconia, you could not pack up your family and move to a region with better weather, because there was no region with better weather. The entire continent was afflicted, and everyone in it was on their own. This continental scope is what makes the 1540 drought unique in European history. There have been other severe droughts. 1573 was bad, and 1615 was terrible, but none covered such a vast area for such a prolonged period. Modern climate scientists, using the evidence of tree rings from across Europe, have confirmed what the chronicles describe. 1540 was, by a significant margin, the driest year of the past 5 centuries and possibly of the past millennium. The decade from 1531 to 1540 was the driest summer decade in 500 years, and 1540 was the peak of that decade-long dry spell, the culmination of a trend that had been building for years. What caused it? Historians still argue about the precise meteorological mechanisms, but the leading theory involves a persistent blocking pattern in the jet stream, the high-altitude river of air that governs weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. In normal years, the jet stream carries moisture-laden air masses from the Atlantic across Europe, producing the regular cycle of rain and sunshine that sustains the continent's agriculture. In 1540, something caused the jet stream to shift, creating a massive high-pressure ridge that parked over Central Europe and refused to move. This ridge deflected the rain-bearing weather systems to the north and south, leaving the vast area in between under a dome of hot, dry, sinking air that produced endless sunshine and not a drop of rain. The trigger for this blocking pattern is unknown. Some researchers speculate about the role of ocean temperatures in the Atlantic, others about volcanic activity or solar variability. The truth is that we do not know, and we may never know, what set the chain of events in motion that resulted in the worst drought in European recorded history. What we do know is that it happened, that it was catastrophic, and that the people who lived through it bore their suffering with a resilience and a determination that, across the centuries, commands both admiration and a quiet, persistent sadness. Let us return to you, to your village, to the slow rebuilding of your life in the aftermath of the catastrophe. It is now the spring of 1541, and you are in your field plowing. The horse that pulls the plow is thin. It survived the drought, but barely, and its ribs show through its dull coat like the slats of a wicker basket. You have given it extra feed when you can. But feed is scarce and expensive, and the horse must share what there is with the few remaining cattle and the handful of chickens that were not slaughtered or starved during the summer. The plow cuts through the earth, and you guide it with hands that are calloused and cracked. The soil is better this year. The winter rains and spring thaws have restored some of its moisture, but it is not what it was. The topsoil, the rich, dark, fertile layer that took centuries to build up, was damaged by the drought. In many places, it was simply blown away as dust during the months of dry wind, leaving behind a lighter, sandier, less productive layer. In other places, the extreme heat altered the soil structure, breaking down the organic matter that gives it its richness and its ability to hold water. The fields will produce this year, but they will not produce as well as they did before the drought. And it will take years of careful husbandry, composting, manuring, rotating crops, letting fields lie fallow, to restore them to their former fertility. You sow rye and wheat, the staples of your diet. You also plant a small patch of flax, which will provide the linen fiber that your wife needs for cloth. You plant beans and turnips and cabbages in the kitchen garden, and you watch them every day with the anxious attention of a man who knows exactly what it means when plants do not grow. The rain comes this spring, thank God, not in great sheets, but in gentle, regular showers that soak the earth and nourish the seedlings. Each rainfall is a small miracle, a reassurance that the world has not permanently broken. Your wife is recovering, though slowly. The cough that plagued her through the winter has eased somewhat, and with better food and cleaner water, her strength is returning. The baby, born in the worst of times, is small but determined, clutching at your finger with a grip that belies his tiny size. Your older children are beginning to behave like children again, running, playing, quarreling over trifles, their resilience a constant source of wonder to you. Children forget faster than adults, and the terrors of the previous summer are already fading in their minds, replaced by the immediate concerns of spring, a bird's nest found in the hedge, a frog discovered in the newly wet ditch, the fascinating process of seeds becoming plants, becoming food. But you do not forget. You cannot forget. The drought of 1540 has etched itself into your memory like an inscription carved in stone, and you will carry it with you for the rest of your life. It will influence every decision you make about your farm, your family, your future. You will never again plant only one crop because you saw what happened when the rye failed and there was nothing to fall back on. You will always keep a reserve of grain hidden away in the deepest part of your cellar, even if it means eating less in good years. Because you know what it is like to face winter with an empty larder, you will dig your well deeper and line it with stone. Because you know that a shallow well can run dry when you need it most. The village itself is changed. It is smaller. The deaths of the summer reduced the population by perhaps 10 or 15%, and some of the survivors have left, moving to towns or distant regions in search of better opportunities. The empty cottages stand as silent reminders of those who are gone, their thatched roofs sagging, their gardens running wild with weeds. Some will be occupied again as new families move in or existing families expand. Others will slowly decay and collapse, returning to the earth from which they were built, until nothing remains but a slight rise in the ground where the walls once stood. The social dynamics of the village have shifted. The death and departure of so many people has created opportunities as well as losses. Land that was held by families who died or left is now available to those who remain. If you are enterprising and willing to work, you can expand your holding, taking on additional fields and building up a larger, more productive farm. The labor shortage, for there are fewer hands to do the work, pushes up wages for hired laborers and gives the surviving peasants more bargaining power with their lords. It is a bitter irony that catastrophe can be the engine of economic improvement for those who survive it, but it is a pattern that has repeated itself throughout history. From the aftermath of the Black Death to the restructuring that follows any great disaster, you expand your holding cautiously, taking on one additional field and negotiating with the Lord for a reduced rent in exchange for bringing it under cultivation. The Lord agrees. He needs productive land more than he needs the full rent, and you find yourself, almost despite yourself, in a slightly better position than you were before the drought. Not prosperous, not comfortable, but marginally more secure. You have more land, more options, more room to maneuver. The drought took so much from you, but it also created a space, literally, a physical space of empty land and abandoned homes, in which a new beginning is possible. The spring of 1541 also brings news from the wider world. News that has nothing to do with the drought, but everything to do with the turbulent era in which you live. The Reformation continues to reshape the religious and political landscape of Europe, and the tensions that the drought inflamed, the accusations of arson, the theological finger-pointing, the sectarian hostility have not dissipated with the return of the rains. If anything, they have hardened, crystallized by the suffering of the past year into fixed positions and irreconcilable grievances. In the German territories, the complicated patchwork of Protestant and Catholic states continues to shift and realign. The Peace of Nuremberg, which in 1532 granted temporary toleration to the Lutherans, is fraying at the edges. The Emperor Charles V, who rules a vast realm that stretches from Spain to the Netherlands to Austria, is trying to hold his empire together while dealing with the Ottoman threat to the east and the French threat to the west and the Protestant rebellion in the middle. The drought of 1540 has not made his task any easier. The economic damage has reduced tax revenues. The social unrest has complicated governance. The arsonist paranoia has poisoned relations between Protestant and Catholic communities that were already barely civil to each other. You do not think about these grand political matters much. Emperors and popes and princes are distant figures, their quarrels as remote from your daily life as the movements of the stars. What matters to you is the rain on your field, the bread in your oven, the health of your children. But the political world has a way of intruding on the personal, and the religious tensions that are tearing Europe apart will eventually touch your life in ways you cannot yet imagine. For now, however, the spring proceeds. The crops grow, the animals breed. The rhythms of rural life reassert themselves with a persistence that is, in its quiet way, heroic. You plow and sow and weed and water. You fix the fence that the wind damaged in March. You repair the roof that leaks when the spring rains come. You mend your tools and sharpen your scythe and prepare for the harvest that you hope, pray, beg, bargain with God will be better than last year's. The days grow longer, and the sun, that tyrant of last summer, now shines with a gentler, kinder light that warms without burning. You have learned not to trust it entirely. You have learned that the sun can be an enemy as well as a friend, and you watch it now with a wary respect, as you might watch a large dog that has once bitten you. The water mills are turning again. You can hear the distant splash and creak of the mill wheel from your field on quiet mornings, and the sound fills you with a disproportionate joy. The mill wheel turning means water flowing, means grain grinding, means flour milling, means bread baking. It is the sound of civilization working, the sound of the intricate machinery of medieval life clicking back into gear after its catastrophic breakdown. The miller himself is a changed man. He went through the drought with the rest of you, watching his livelihood dry up along with the stream that powered his wheel. He is thinner and grayer, and he has a nervous habit of checking the water level several times a day, even now when the stream is flowing normally. The drought has given him an anxiety that he will carry for the rest of his life, a constant, low-level fear that the water will stop and the wheel will fall silent and the famine will return. The blacksmith has reopened his forge, and the ring of his hammer on the anvil is another welcome sound. He is making plowshares and hoes and sickles, the tools of agriculture, because the damage and wear of the past year have left many farmers with equipment that needs repair or replacement. Business is good for the blacksmith, which is one of those paradoxes of disaster. The destruction creates demand for the services of those who rebuild. The carpenter is busy too, repairing roofs and doors and shutters that were damaged by the fires or simply neglected during the months when survival took priority over maintenance. The women of the village are engaged in their own work of restoration. The kitchen gardens that died in the summer of 1540 are being replanted. The chickens that were lost are being replaced with new birds, purchased or traded from more fortunate communities. The spinning and weaving that provide the household's cloth go on, though the supply of flax and wool is limited by the damage to the fields and the loss of sheep. There is a quiet determination in the way the women work. A refusal to be defeated that is both admirable and heartbreaking. They have lost children, neighbors, health, security. They have watched their world come apart at the seams. And now, without fanfare or complaint, they are stitching it back together. You watch your wife in the garden, bending over the newly planted rows, and you are struck by the simple, stubborn miracle of human perseverance. She is thinner than she was a year ago, her hair has new streaks of gray, and the cough has not entirely gone. But she is planting. She is putting seeds in the earth and watering them and pulling weeds. Investing her labor in the future with a faith that no drought can destroy. It is the most ordinary act in the world, and it is the bravest thing you have ever seen. The summer of 1541 passes without incident. The rains come when they should. The sun shines when it should. The crops grow. The rivers flow. The wells hold. It is the most beautifully ordinary summer in the history of the world, and you appreciate every mundane, unremarkable, gloriously normal day of it with an intensity that would be impossible for anyone who has not lived through what you have lived through. You check the sky every morning, and when you see clouds, real clouds, drifting lazily across the blue, you feel a gratitude so deep it borders on religious ecstasy. The harvest of 1541 is adequate. Not bountiful, the depleted soil and reduced livestock herds see to that, but adequate. There is enough grain to feed your family, to pay the Lord and the church, to set aside a modest reserve for the future. The vegetable garden produces a reasonable crop of cabbages and turnips and beans. The orchard, which suffered badly last year, produces a small crop of apples that are slightly misshapen and slightly wormy, but taste, to your drought-trained palate, like heaven. You bite into an apple in your orchard on a September afternoon, and the juice runs down your chin, and you close your eyes and let the sweetness of it overwhelm you. An apple, such a simple thing, such an extraordinary gift. The vintage of 1541 is unremarkable, a perfectly average wine that tastes to most people perfectly fine. But to you, it tastes wrong. It tastes thin and watery after the extraordinary sweetness of the 1540 wine. Your palate has been recalibrated by that anomalous vintage, and it will take years before you can appreciate normal wine again. This is a small thing, a trivial thing, but it is emblematic of the way. The drought has altered your perception of the world. Everything is measured against the baseline of 1540. Every rain shower is compared to the rain that did not fall. Every harvest is measured against the harvest that failed. Every healthy child is seen through the lens of the children who died. The village healer, an old woman who knows the properties of herbs and roots and who served as the closest thing to a doctor during the epidemic, tells you that this is normal. The mind, she says, takes longer to heal than the body. She has seen it before in the old people who survived the Great Plague and never quite recovered their peace of mind. The body recovers, she says, but the spirit remembers. You nod because you know she is right. You feel it in yourself. The watchfulness, the anxiety, the inability to fully trust the apparent normalcy of the present. Part of you is always waiting for the next disaster, the next drought, the next fire, the next epidemic. Part of you will always be standing in a dusty field in July of 1540, watching the sky for clouds that never come. The community heals too, though unevenly and incompletely. The social bonds that frayed during the drought, the disputes over water, the suspicion of strangers, The anger at the Lord and the church are slowly rewoven, but the fabric is not as strong as it was. There are grudges that will never be forgiven, debts that will never be repaid, friendships that were broken by the stress of survival and cannot be mended. The village is functional, but it is not the same village it was before the drought, just as you are not the same person you were before the drought. New stories enter the village's collective memory, stories that will be told and retold for generations, growing and changing in the telling, becoming the legends and cautionary tales that shape the community's identity. The story of the well that ran dry and the argument between two families over the last bucket of water, the story of the miller who hitched his horse to the grinding stones and kept the village in flower when the stream dried up. The story of the stranger who passed through on the day the barn caught fire and who was either an innocent traveler or an arsonist depending on who tells the tale. The story of the cheap sweet wine and the year everyone in Cologne lay drunk in the gutters. The story of the Einbeck fire, 500 dead in an afternoon. These stories become the folklore of the drought, the narrative scaffolding on which the community hangs its memory of the worst year anyone can recall. You tell these stories to your children at bedtime, sanitized and softened for young ears. You tell them about the summer when it was so hot that the rivers dried up and you could walk across the Rhine. You tell them about the wine that was so sweet it tasted like honey. You do not tell them about the dead neighbors, the dysentery, the terror, the desperation. Not yet. They are too young for that. But someday, when they are older, you will tell them the whole truth because they need to know. They need to understand that the world can break, that the things they take for granted, water, food, shelter, safety, can be snatched away in an instant by forces beyond human comprehension or control. They need to learn, as you learned, to respect the weather, to prepare for the worst, to hold lightly to the comforts of the present. Let us widen our view once more and consider the legacy of that 1540 drought in the long sweep of European history. The immediate aftermath, the famine, the economic disruption, the social tension, played out over the following 2 to 3 years. By 1543 or so, most communities had recovered to something approaching normalcy, though the recovery was uneven and some regions took much longer than others. The areas that had been most severely affected, the river valleys where water sources completely dried up, the towns that burned, the districts where the death toll from disease was highest, bore the scars of the drought for a decade or more. The economic impact was particularly long-lasting. The destruction of livestock herds, which took years to rebuild, depressed the production of meat, dairy, and wool for much of the 1540s. The damage to the soil, caused by the extreme drying and the loss of topsoil to wind erosion, reduced crop yields for several years. The disruption to trade, caused by the drying up of navigable rivers and the destruction of infrastructure, slowed economic growth across the continent. The debts incurred by farmers and communities during the crisis, borrowing at high interest rates to buy food and seed, weighed on the economy for years, diverting income from productive investment into debt service. The cultural impact was subtler, but perhaps more profound. The 1540 drought contributed to a deepening of the religious anxieties that characterized the age. The experience of unexplained catastrophe, of suffering that seemed arbitrary and meaningless, reinforced the belief that the world was a fallen and dangerous place, that evil forces were at work, that human sin invited divine punishment. This mindset, already well established by the Reformation's emphasis on human depravity and the need for salvation, was intensified by the trauma of the drought. Historians still argue about the extent to which the 1540 drought contributed to the witch panic that swept through Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but there is a persuasive case to be made that the experience of inexplicable, uncontrollable natural disaster primed the population for the belief in witchcraft as an explanation for misfortune. The arsonist panic of 1540 itself can be seen as a precursor to the witch trials. The mechanisms are strikingly similar. A community in crisis seeks an explanation for its suffering. The explanation focuses on malevolent human agency, arsonists or witches, rather than on impersonal natural forces. Suspects are identified from among the most vulnerable and marginal members of society. Confessions are extracted by torture. Executions follow. The executions do not solve the underlying problem because the underlying problem is not human but natural. But they provide the community with a sense of agency and catharsis, a feeling that something is being done, that the enemy has been identified and punished. The transition from blaming arsonists to blaming witches is a short step, and the drought of 1540 may have helped to establish the pattern. There is also a scientific legacy, though it is one that would not be recognized for centuries. The 1540 drought, documented in more than 300 first-hand sources, provides one of the richest archives of pre-instrumental climate data in European history. Modern climate scientists have used these records, the chronicles, the weather diaries, the administrative documents, the wine harvest dates, to reconstruct the climate of the year with remarkable precision. The research, published in journals like Climatic Change and Climate of the Past, has established 1540 as a benchmark event, a reference point against which other droughts are measured. The 1540 data has also contributed to the broader field of historical climatology, which uses documentary evidence to extend the climate record back beyond the era of instrumental measurement. This field, pioneered by researchers like Christian Pfister at the University of Bern, has transformed our understanding of European climate history. We now know that the climate of the past was far more variable than previously assumed, with extreme events like the 1540 drought occurring periodically and causing immense human suffering. This knowledge has implications for our understanding of future climate risks because it tells us that extreme events are not anomalies but features of the climate system, and that even without anthropogenic climate change, the potential for catastrophic drought is built into the natural variability of European weather. The wine legacy is the most tangible and, in its way, the most poignant. The 1540 vintage, that extraordinary product of extraordinary suffering, survives in a few rare bottles that are among the oldest drinkable wines in the world. The most famous is a bottle from the Würzburger Stein vineyard, preserved in the cellars of the Burgerspittel in Würzburg, where it has been carefully maintained for nearly 5 centuries. Tasting notes from the rare occasions when the wine has been opened describe a liquid that is dark amber in color, intensely sweet, with flavors of dried fruit and honey and caramel. It is, by all accounts, remarkable, a wine that has outlived every person who lived through the drought that created it, a liquid fossil of a vanished world. That a year of such suffering should produce a wine of such beauty is one of those ironic juxtapositions that history delights in. The vine growers of 1540 did not intend to create a masterpiece. They were simply trying to salvage what they could from a ruined harvest. But the extreme conditions, the concentrated sugars, the intense flavors, the natural raisoning of the grapes on the vine, produced something that transcended the circumstances of its creation. The Kaiser vine is a monument to human resilience as much as it is to viticultural excellence. It is the taste of survival. Let us come back to you one last time in the quiet of a late autumn evening in 1541. The harvest is in. The barn is not full, but it is fuller than it was at this time last year, and the difference between not quite enough and barely anything is the difference between anxiety and despair. You have anxiety. You can live with anxiety. Despair, which you felt in the pit of your stomach throughout the summer of 1540, is a place you do not wish to visit again. You are sitting outside your cottage, wrapped in a wool cloak against the chill, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The trees along the road are properly autumnal now, their leaves turning gold and crimson and russet in the way they are supposed to, at the time they are supposed to. The natural order of the seasons has been restored, and the simple fact that leaves are changing color on schedule feels like a small miracle. Last year at this time, the trees were already bare, stripped of their foliage months early by the drought. This year, they are doing what trees have always done, following the ancient rhythm of growth and decline and renewal that is the heartbeat of the temperate world. Your wife comes out with 2 cups of cider. The apples were just enough to press a small barrel, and sits down beside you. You drink in companionable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The cider is tart and rough, nothing special, but it is the product of your own orchard, made from apples that grew in soil you tended, watered by rain that fell from a sky you prayed to, and it tastes, for all its roughness, like accomplishment. You made it through. You are here. The cider is proof. Your children are inside, asleep or nearly so. The baby is teething and fretful, and your daughter is telling your son a story she has invented about a magical well that never runs dry. You hear their voices through the open window, soft and sleepy, and you smile. The magical well that never runs dry. If only such a thing existed. But wells do run dry. You know that now, with a certainty that is carved into your bones, and the only protection against it is prudence and preparation and the kind of stubborn, unromantic, day-by-day effort that keeps the well dug deep and the stored water clean and the reserve grain saved in the cellar. The stars are thick now, a vast glittering canopy that stretches from horizon to horizon. You look up at them and think about time, about the way this year has aged you, about the person you were before the drought and the person you are now. You are harder, certainly, less trusting, more cautious, more aware of how quickly things can go wrong, but you are also more grateful, more attentive to the small blessings that you once took for granted. Rain, shade, a full cup of clean water, the sound of a stream, the green of a living field. The drought burned away your complacency, and what it left behind is a raw, vivid appreciation for the basic elements of life that you will never lose. The wind shifts, and you smell wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and damp earth from the field, and the faint sweetness of the last wild roses blooming in the hedgerow. These are the smells of home, of normality, of the world as it should be. You breathe them in and hold them, committing them to memory because you know now that they can be taken away, and you want to remember them always, even if, especially if, they are taken away again. Your wife finishes her cider and stands up, stretching. "Time for bed," she says. You nod and rise, gathering the cups. Inside, the cottage is warm with the heat of bodies and the small fire. The baby has finally fallen asleep, his tiny fist curled against his cheek. Your daughter is still whispering her story about the magical well, but her eyes are closing, and her words are losing their shape, dissolving into the soft mumble of approaching sleep. Your son is already gone, his breathing deep and regular, his face peaceful in the firelight. You lie down beside your wife and pull the blanket over both of you. The straw mattress rustles beneath you, familiar and comforting. The fire pops and settles. Outside, an owl calls from the bare branches of the oak tree, and somewhere in the distance, a fox barks. These are the sounds of the night, the eternal soundtrack of the European countryside, unchanged since before the drought and unchanged after it. The drought came and went, and the owl still calls, and the fox still barks, and the stars still turn overhead in their slow, indifferent dance. Let us pause here, in this moment of quiet and recovery, and reflect on what you have been through. You are not a hero. You are not a saint or a scholar or a warrior. You are an ordinary person who lived through an extraordinary time, and the tools you used to survive were not extraordinary either. Stubbornness, ingenuity, luck, the help of neighbors, and the resilience of a community that bent under the pressure but did not break. These are the tools of survival in every age, and they are available to everyone, though they are not always enough. The 1540 drought killed an estimated 500,000 people across Europe. That number deserves to be repeated and remembered because each of those 500,000 was a person like you, with a family, a home, a history, hopes and fears and plans for the future that were cut short by contaminated water or uncontrollable fire or simple, brutal heat. The chronicles record their deaths in aggregate as statistics and summaries, but each death was individual and specific and mourned by someone. A father who could not find clean water for his sick child, a grandmother who was too frail to survive the heat, a young woman who drank from a well that was polluted with the runoff of a dried-up cesspit, an artisan who was burned alive in the Einbeck fire, a vagabond who was tortured into a false confession and executed for a crime that was not a crime. These are the people of 1540, and their stories, mostly unrecorded, are the true history of the drought. The chronicles give us the outlines, the temperatures, the dates, the river levels, the death tolls, but the human experience, the texture and detail and emotion of living through it can only be imagined. And that is what we have been doing tonight, imagining our way into a world without rain, trying to feel what it felt like to stand in a parched field under a blazing sky and wonder if the world was ending. The world was not ending, of course. It just felt that way. The rain came back, the rivers refilled, the crops grew again. Life went on, as life always does, finding its way through and around and over the obstacles that the world places in its path. The 1540 drought was a catastrophe, but it was not the end. It was a chapter a terrible, destructive, heart-rending chapter in the ongoing story of European civilization, a story that continued and continues and will continue long after the last memory of the drought has faded. But the memory has not faded entirely. It lives on in the archives and libraries of Europe, in the chronicles of Heinrich Bullinger and Fridolin Riffe and Hermann von Weinsberg and dozens of other careful observers who took the trouble to write down what they saw. It lives on in the climate data reconstructed by modern scientists, in the tree ring chronologies and ice core records that confirm and quantify what the chroniclers described. It lives on in the cellars of the Burgerspittel in Würzburg, where a bottle of 1540 Kaiserwein sits in darkness, a liquid time capsule of the hottest year in memory. And it lives on in stories like this one, told in the quiet hours of the night to listeners who are easing towards sleep, carried on the gentle current of words from a world 5 centuries removed from our own. The people of 1540 cannot tell their own story. They are dust, their bones long since dissolved, their faces forgotten, their voices silent. But their experience is not lost because it was recorded and because we can read those records and imagine ourselves into them, feeling the heat on our skin, the dust in our eyes, the thirst in our throats, the fear in our hearts. Historians still argue about the precise severity of the 1540 drought, about whether it was truly worse than 2003, about the accuracy of the temperature reconstructions, about the reliability of the death toll estimates. These debates are important and valuable because they refine our understanding and correct our errors, but they should not obscure the essential, undeniable fact at the heart of the story, that real people in a real time suffered greatly and endured greatly and survived mostly by the exercise of ordinary virtues in extraordinary circumstances. You are drifting now. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers, glowing soft orange in the darkness. Your wife's breathing has deepened into the slow rhythm of sleep. The baby makes a small sound, a murmur of contentment, and settles deeper into his nest of blankets. The cottage is warm and dark and quiet, and you are floating in that pleasant space between waking and sleep where thoughts come loose from their moorings and drift like leaves on a slow river. You think about water, not the desperate, anxious thoughts of water that consumed you during the drought, but gentler, softer thoughts. The sound of rain on the thatch roof, that soft patter that is the lullaby of the European countryside. The sight of a stream in spring, swollen with snowmelt, tumbling over rocks with a cheerful, chattering energy. The feel of cool water on your face in the morning, splashed from a full bucket drawn from a deep, clean well. These are the sensations that the drought taught you to treasure, the small, liquid miracles that you will never again take for granted. Water. It is such a simple thing. A molecule of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, though you do not know that, and would not understand the concept if someone explained it to you. You know water as a substance, a presence, a necessity. You know it as the rain that feeds your crops, the stream that turns your mill, the well that slakes your thirst, the river that carries your goods to market. You know it as the baptismal water that welcomed you into the Christian community, the holy water that blesses your home, the tears that salt your cheeks in times of grief and joy. Water is woven into every aspect of your life, every ritual, every task, every pleasure, and the year it disappeared was the year the world stopped making sense. But the world makes sense again now. The rain falls, the stream flows, the well holds, and you, lying on your straw mattress in your small stone cottage in a village whose name will not appear in any history book, are proof that sense can be restored, that the world can break and be mended, that even the worst drought in recorded history is, in the end, something that can be survived. Your eyelids are heavy. The thoughts are becoming more scattered, more dreamlike. You see images, fragments, memories, a cracked field under a white sun, a bucket coming up from a well, half empty, the water cloudy. The face of your neighbor, gaunt and fevered, in the grip of dysentery, the glow of a distant forest fire on the horizon. A cup of sweet wine, honey thick and potent. The first raindrop landing on your upturned face, breaking 9 months of silence. Your daughter catching snowflakes on her tongue on Christmas Eve. An apple in your hand, juice running down your chin. These are the images of 1540, your 1540, the personal version of the Great Drought. That belongs to you and no one else. Every person who lived through it has their own version, their own collection of images and memories, their own story that is unlike any other story, even though the broad outlines are the same. This is the paradox of history, that it is simultaneously universal and particular, shared and solitary, a common experience that is experienced uniquely by every individual who passes through it. You smile in the darkness, though you are not sure why. Perhaps it is the cider settling warm in your stomach. Perhaps it is the sound of your children breathing. Perhaps it is the simple, profound relief of being alive and warm and dry and fed on a cool autumn night, knowing that the worst is behind you and the future, while uncertain, holds at least the possibility of better days. Whatever the reason, the smile lingers on your face as sleep takes you, pulling you gently down into the soft, dark, dreamless place where even the memory of drought cannot follow. The years pass. 1542, 43, 44. The weather returns to its normal patterns of rain and shine, cold and warm, the familiar, unpredictable predictability of European climate. Good years and bad years, wet springs and dry summers, early frosts and late thaws, but nothing approaches the extremity of 1540. That year stands alone in the chronicle of European weather. Singular event, a peak of heat and drought that towers above the landscape of climate history like a mountain above a plain. You grow older, your children grow taller, your wife's cough comes and goes with the seasons, but never quite disappears. The village slowly fills in the gaps left by the drought, as new families arrive and old families expand and the empty cottages are repaired and reoccupied. The fields regain their fertility, helped by years of careful composting and manuring and the resilience of the soil itself. The forests, where they were not too badly burned, regenerate with the stubborn vitality of wild things, sending up new shoots from charred stumps, reclaiming the spaces that fire opened up. The watermills turn and the forges ring and the market stalls fill up, and the roads carry the traffic of commerce and pilgrimage and ordinary movement that is the lifeblood of any community. The rhythms of life that were disrupted so violently in 1540 have been restored, and the years take on a sameness that is, after the drama of the drought, deeply comforting. Sameness is underrated. Routine is underrated. The beauty of an ordinary day in which nothing remarkable happens and everything works as it should is invisible until you have experienced a day in which nothing works at all. You find yourself becoming the old person who tells stories of the drought. At first, you resist the role. You do not want to be the village bore, the tiresome elder who begins every conversation with "in my day" and ends it with a moral lecture about the softness of the younger generation. But the stories insist on being told, and the younger people insist on hearing them. And so you find yourself at the tavern on winter evenings, a cup of wine in your hand, holding forth about the summer the rivers ran dry, and the wells went empty, and the sky forgot how to rain. Your audience listens with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. They believe you. The evidence of the drought is still visible in the landscape, in the fire-scarred trees and the rebuilt houses and the extended scar of bare earth where a forest once stood, but they cannot quite feel it. They have never known real thirst, real heat, real fear of fire and famine. They have grown up in a world where rain falls and rivers flow and wells hold water, and they assume, as you once assumed, that this is simply how things are. They do not understand, as you understand, that the normalcy they take for granted is as thin and fragile as the skin of ice on a winter puddle, easily shattered by forces that no human can control. You do not blame them for their inability to feel what you felt. Each generation must learn its own lessons, suffer its own catastrophes, earn its own wisdom. You can tell them what happened. You can describe the cracked earth, and the dead animals, and the burning towns, and the sweet, dangerous wine. But you cannot make them feel the dust in their throats, or the fear in their bellies, or the aching, desperate longing for a single drop of rain. That knowledge comes only from experience, and you would not wish the experience on anyone. And so you tell your stories, and the young people listen and nod and buy you another cup of wine, and the fire crackles, and the wind blows outside, and the rain, blessed, ordinary, taken for granted rain, patters on the roof of the tavern, and somewhere deep inside you, a part of you that has been tense and watchful since 1540 relaxes, just a little, just for a moment, and allows itself to believe that the rain will keep falling, that the wells will keep filling, that the world will keep working as it should. The bottle of Kaiserwein from Würzburg sits in its cellar, aging in the darkness. It will outlive you by centuries. Long after your bones are dust and your village has changed beyond recognition, and even the language you speak has shifted and evolved into something you would not recognize. That bottle will still be there, a silent witness to the year the sun tried to burn Europe to the ground. Future generations will open it on rare and special occasions and taste something that is 500 years old, and they will wonder about the people who made it, the people who survived the conditions that created it, the people who lived and died and suffered and endured in the worst year anyone could remember. They will wonder about you, and now it is time to sleep. You have traveled a long road tonight, from the first ominous dryness of February to the burning heat of July, through the fires and the disease and the cheap sweet wine, through the arsonist paranoia and the empty wells and the dying rivers, through the slow, painful recovery and the long, quiet work of rebuilding. You have walked across the bed of the Rhine and stood on the shores of a shrunken Lake Constance. You have smelled the smoke of burning Einbeck and tasted the honey-sweet Kaiserwein of Würzburg. You have prayed for rain and watched children die and stumbled through the darkness of a summer that seemed like it would never end. But it did end. They always do. The worst summers end. The deepest droughts break. The rain comes back. The earth, that patient, enduring, miraculous substance, heals itself, given time. And the people who live upon it heal too, slowly and imperfectly, carrying their scars like maps of the places they have been and the things they have survived. The fire in your cottage is down to its last ember, a single point of orange light in the darkness. Your breathing has slowed. Your thoughts are dissolving. The images of 1540 are fading now, retreating into the deep archives of memory, settling into the place where the past lives when we are not looking at it. The cracked earth, the blazing sky, the empty well, the burning town, all of it is softening, blurring, losing its sharp edges, becoming something gentler, something bearable, something that can be carried without breaking. The rain is falling outside. You can hear it, soft and steady on the thatch, a sound so ordinary and so beautiful that it fills you with a peace that passes understanding. Rain, just rain, water falling from the sky, as it has fallen for billions of years, as it will fall for billions more long after you and your village and your entire civilization have been forgotten. The rain does not know about your drought. The rain does not care about your suffering. The rain simply falls, because that is what rain does. And the earth drinks it in, because that is what earth does. And the cycle continues, as it has always continued, as it will always continue. Your eyes are closed now. Your body is heavy with sleep. The sounds of the night, the rain, the wind, the owl, the fox, the breathing of your family wrap around you like a blanket, soft and warm and safe. You are sinking into sleep, into the deep, still water of unconsciousness, and the last thing you think, before thought itself dissolves, is this: the rain is falling. The wells will fill, the fields will green, the rivers will rise, spring will come. Sleep now. The drought is over, the rain is here. Let the soft sound of it carry you away, down the gentle current of the night, into the warm, dark, quiet place where no sun burns, and no thirst stings and no fire threatens. Let go of 1540. Let go of the heat and the dust and the fear. Let go of everything and let the rain sing you to sleep. You are safe. You are home. The rain is falling. Sleep now. Let the rain wash everything clean. The wells are filling in the darkness slowly, silently, drop by drop. You are already dreaming. The rain falls on. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.